listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am your indefatigable, your burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, good morning, everybody. It is just past 7 a.m. Eastern. It is December 9th, 2021. You know, yesterday, Jamarl, was the Pretend You're a Time Traveler Day.
Yeah.
If there are any real time travelers today,
Feel free to call in for one.
Feel free to call in for one. We will take your call. We will. I don't know how long we'll do an interview with you for, but we'll take your call. We'd love to talk with you. And also, I just wanted to reorient you. Again, it's 7 a.m. Eastern, just past 7 a.m. Eastern. It's December 9th, 2021. Anyway, let's get into headlines. First up in COVID stats this morning. Yesterday in the United States, there were 149,041 new COVID cases reported, also 1,851 deaths reported here. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 121,000 cases per day. That's an increase of 27% from the average 2 weeks ago. 60% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated. 71% of residents have received at least one dose. And as of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 49,505,000 people across the United States. It has killed 791,933 people here in the U.S. In national news, President Joe Biden is set to participate in a virtual Summit for Democracy from the White House beginning today. He'll host more than 100 participants representing governments, civil society, and private sector leaders. The summit has been billed as an opportunity to collaborate on fighting corruption and promoting respect for human rights. However, the gathering has drawn backlash from the United States' chief adversaries and other nations that were not invited to participate. The ambassadors to the U.S. from China and Russia wrote a joint essay in the National Interest Policy Journal describing the Biden administration as exhibiting a Cold War mentality, quote unquote, that will, quote, stoke up ideological confrontation and a rift in the world, end quote. The governors of Maine and New York deployed the National Guard in response to dangerously low capacity at statewide medical facilities due to the pandemic. The New York National Guard announced Wednesday that it had deployed 120 medics and medical technicians to a dozen long-term care facilities statewide. The deployment came at the behest of Governor Kathy Hochul, who issued the order last week in response to staffing shortages. Former Trump White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows is suing the House Select Committee investigating January 6th and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, asking a federal court to block enforcement of the subpoena the committee issued him, as well as the subpoena it issued to Verizon for his phone records, according to the complaint filed Wednesday. Yeah, no wonder. I want to come back to this in a couple minutes. The lawsuit comes after the committee signaled it would pursue a criminal contempt referral against Meadows because of his refusal to sit for a deposition in the investigation into the Capitol riot. Meadows alleges that the subpoenas are, quote, overly broad and unduly burdensome, end quote, while claiming that the committee, quote, lacks lawful authority to seek and to obtain, end quote, the information requested. The Senate will begin considering a bill on Thursday that would create a fast-track process allowing Democrats to raise the federal debt limit without votes from Republicans, a crucial next step as lawmakers race the clock to avert a catastrophic debt default. A first-ever default would trigger financial disaster. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has warned the debt limit could be reached on December 15th. That would leave little time left to act. Party leaders on both sides of the aisle have been clear that the default must be prevented, but Republicans have insisted that Democrats should bear the burden of raising the limit on their own, something we've been talking about, of course. In international news, Evergrande, the embattled Chinese property developer, has defaulted on its debt. That's according to Fitch Ratings. The credit ratings agency on Thursday downgraded the company and its subsidiaries to, quote-unquote, restricted default, meaning that the firm has failed to meet its financial obligations. In sports news, the Arizona Coyotes of the National Hockey League could potentially be without access to their home arena later this month if delinquent taxes and back rent aren't paid. That's according to a letter sent to team ownership from Glendale City Manager Kevin Phelps. In holiday news, today is Christmas Card Day. Oh yeah. International Anti-Corruption Day.
Every day.
And International Day of Veterinary Medicine. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Some of that stuff should be every day. It's like hand washing day. It's like, do you really want a day for hand washing, or is there something you just kind of, do because good reason?
That's you say that about these holidays. That's been my I've mentioned this before. My long-term war on holidays always has to do with the arbitrariness of the holidays.
Yeah.
Some holidays clearly aren't arbitrary. Like there's a day supposed to represent when Jesus is born, for instance, in the whole Christian tradition. There are different holidays representing different things. They're tied to things. But my point is like the things that you do on those holidays, like being nice to each other or being thankful or giving each other gifts.
Just be life.
Or like pulling pranks on each other, which is another holiday. April Fool's Day.
Yeah.
We just do this stuff, and the thought is, okay, we do this all in this one day, but wouldn't it be cool if we could do it every day? But then, I don't know, that's the point of a holiday, right? Is to be like, hey, this is the thing for this thing.
It undermines the specialness of it. It's done every day,
Yeah, maybe it undermines the specialness of it, but yeah, anyway, that's the long-term war over holidays. I want to go back,
go for it.
I want to go back briefly to this Mark Meadows thing. Because do you remember, I remember talking about it last week, when Mark Meadows said that he was basically complying with the committee investigating January 6th and what went on there. Mm-hmm. Did we talk about this on this show? I was in the backstory. We talked about it there. It might not have come up as much here, though I think even then it did. Basically, Mark Meadows, Trump's chief of staff, of course, former chief of staff, said he would be working with the January 6th committee, the House committee investigating this stuff. So that was a sign, and I was talking about this with John in the backstory. We're just going back and forth. And he was like, we were talking, it seems like a major sign that he's working with them in some way, and that he's more than willing to in some way. What does this represent? Does this mean that he's just signaling compliance, or does this mean that he's signaling, like, earnestness, and he's going after Trump? Probably not the second one, probably the first. But then this week, of course, in fact, just yesterday, he turns on them completely and says that he'll go after them because they're going way too far and trying to get phone records of his that, as far as I can tell, they might technically be able to make the case that they're relevant, of course, because they're trying to do everything they can to unearth it. Yeah. But it is going too far. And so it's just interesting to see within about a week and a half. I don't know. I'd seen some people.
I would start it off with, okay, he's going to be cooperative.
He's going to be cooperative. He's going to be working with them.
You guys are going too far.
And maybe even turning on Trump. And now it's like, no, they went too far. And no, that's not at all what happened. I don't know. It's just an interesting turn of events.
It's interesting. I don't think anybody wants you digging into their phone records, like talking about, just in general, especially if they feel like they're already negotiating or working with the organization itself. I could see how that could lead to some kind of bad feelings on all of that. It's like I'm working with you guys and you guys are trying to get more information than what I'm comfortable with.
Well, it shows how darn overzealous they are too. It's like what reason do they actually? I get it. Technically, they're wanting those records because there might be incriminating evidence. But are they just going to do that with everybody? Just give us all your records and we're going to sort through all of them? Because not only is that lazy investigative work, as far as I can tell, but it is actually pretty invasive, of course.
It is.
And if they're going to do that with all political leaders after the way they handled Russiagate. And it's a lot of the same people. Mm-hmm. Schiff is the one that comes to mind. After the way they handled Russiagate, can we really trust them to not politicize this? And of course, the answer is no. So then it's like, okay, they're doing these overly invasive retrievals of everybody's phone records. Not everybody, I'm exaggerating slightly. But if that's where it's going, you know what I mean. That it adds to this impression that they're using this investigation entirely to beat down the Republicans politically because they're failing on the national stage with Biden. And they're trying to, dig up whatever dirt they can going into the midterms to create another story to define that coming election, right?
Yes.
Which is that January 6th was a big plot. All these Republicans were in on it. Maybe they were working with the Russians or the Chinese or something. I don't know, but that's what they would be going for, right? That's the only point of this.
I put it this way. I wouldn't put that past them in the least of taking it there. Wouldn't put it past them in the least. I mean, there has been this narrative for the last 4 years that anything that basically came up that they didn't particularly like, Russia or China has something to do with it, working with whoever they were working with. But yeah, they don't want to leave the January 6th thing. I mean, it's one thing if you had a bunch of policies and stuff that you can kind of lean on to kind of say, okay, look, these are the things that we did, and those policies and your activity kind of fills up the time slots in the way that fills up the dialogue that takes place, in regards to the back and forth and the argumentation and everything else. It's another thing when you don't have those things that you can hang your hat on and everything else, and you need to still use the specter of Trump and January 6th, et cetera, as your way of trying to get in office. I don't believe that they could be apolitical on this stuff in the least. I mean, it's a political process. literally in what it is on some level. Even if there's an element of it that's fair game in the sense of trying to get to the bottom of it, I don't believe that they're going to function in this. I mean, maybe they should have had a special prosecutor or something if you're going to do it. But as is, yeah, it's a political process. I mean, again, and I'm not even against them investigating January 6th. I would prefer it to be a more honest and thorough investigation. I don't have an issue with it, but is it political? Absolutely.
Well, so you say thorough, though. This is technically thorough, but I don't know. I don't know what they think they're planning on getting.
Yeah.
Mark Meadows, if I remember correctly, what was the interaction between Trump and Mark Meadows on the day of January 6th?
Now that I don't know.
Because I thought that...
I do know there are some people like McCarthy,
where there was
they
like
got into this big fight.
Screaming
screaming match.
Like, almost like pleading for his life kind of a thing.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
And then turns around and was like, no, everything's good. Trump and I are fine.
No, he's
it's
fine.
like immediately once he gets out of danger, yeah.
Yes. No, because you're saying thorough. Technically, this is thorough, but it's also incredibly invasive. And so I don't know if this isn't thorough. I don't know what they mean.
By thorough, I just mean like you shouldn't isolate it to like you should also look into FBI. I mean, those questions are valid. Like how many agents were there? How many agents entered the building? Why didn't you go after this? Those are questions that legitimately should be answered, even if they want to take this aspect of, okay, we don't believe that there was any concerted effort by the FBI. Okay, fair enough. Then that shouldn't be an issue with you looking into it to discern some of the anomalies that seem to be taking place. And it's not that I have this belief that the FBI did this. I don't have that belief at all. I do have questions about whether or not or how involved they were into it, especially, meaning I believe entirely that the people were going to have the rally, they were going to have the rally. It's a secondary question in whether or not they were going to storm the Capitol. And would they have stormed the Capitol if you didn't have people screaming, let's storm the Capitol?
Yeah,
and the people who were screaming that, who were they? Were they informants? Did they have certain affiliation with that? Those are legitimate questions.
Those are massive questions.
Yeah.
It is super big. That's the thing. Thank you for bringing it to that, because I legitimately didn't know what you meant when you used the word thorough. And I was like, I remember, not early on, but in the immediate months following January 6th, you were leaning one way, and then you still lean that way because, of course, it was an extremely worrying attack.
Absolutely.
Extremely worrying attack. But, like, with the FBI stuff that's come out and with Merrick Garland refusing to answer who Ray Epps is. And
massive deal.
Those questions.
Yeah. Because, look,
the whole false flag thing where the night before you have this unidentified person, well, no, pardon me, an identified person.
He's identified
but maybe working with intel that, Merrick Garland was asked about. The night before this stuff happened, literally calling people to do the thing that they ultimately came to do. And the whole question, of course, was how are they going to get out there? What was the inciting incident? Was there orchestration? If there wasn't orchestration, what did it take to get the crowd to that level? And if there was orchestration, who was orchestrating it?
Exactly.
And of course, the assumption would have been some white supremacist group or whatever. That was the thing. Even though it wasn't a white supremacist event, immediately they tried to pivot to make all of the groups that were attending. And probably some of them do have racialized things. But my point is, it's just like cognitively pivoting the way that we're referring to these things. Anyway, and then it turns out, no, it actually wasn't those groups. If anything, it seems like it was the FBI. It seems like it was the FBI in our own government. So you were going to caveat something.
Well, yeah. I mean, like I said, I don't necessarily know if the FBI had anything to do with the event.
That's what it seems like. That's what it seems like.
Well, the event in and of itself would have always taken place, even if there wasn't one FBI agent to the place. Whether or not they would have raided the Capitol is a question to me. I hope that makes sense.
Maybe. I hear you, and I think probably. But also, the question also now comes to mind, would the event have were there people handling the creation of the event itself, or was it just opportunism on the part of the FBI? Like, there are weird questions about the people orchestrating the Stop the Steal
That's the part
rally.
I don't buy. Yeah, that's the part I don't buy.
Yeah, there are weird things with like Ali Alexander and connections that he has that I've heard, and the way that he trumped the whole thing up, played it all up or whatever, and then didn't actually attend the event. And then like pictures of him with Jack Dorsey. those are legitimately conspiracy. I don't know what's going on there. I'm just saying, to me, there's a possibility.
To me, it makes all the rational sense in the world that Donald Trump screaming about the election, the Stop the Steal rally seemed like it would just be a natural thing. I mean, it's not an anomaly to me that after spending like a month, 2 months screaming that the election was stolen and they're going to steal it from me, et cetera, that he has this kind of big rally to draw attention to it. So that part doesn't get me, that doesn't bother me so much. It's when it gets to these basic questions of, okay, but would they have done what they did. Meaning, because this gets to the whole FBI thing. Like, if you're talking about the Black Panthers, if you're talking about some of these other groups, it's the event is already there. It's the escalation of the event that seems to take place.
I get what you're saying.
And so it's like, you know, if this guy's screaming about going to the Capitol, it seems like the most natural question in the world that should be answered.
But they should
Who
be
is that
investigating.
guy?
Yeah, they should be looking into it.
That's right.
That
and
should be their
the
number
fact
one.
That they're not is problematic to me. I mean,
yeah, that's the window into it. The fact that they're not looking into that is the proof that they're not actually thoroughly investigating it, because that's the most worrying thing that the public knows about that hasn't been answered publicly.
Because they want to be like, oh, nothing to see here, folks.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, you have a large part of the population that doesn't believe that. And even if you don't believe that, and you're just trying to clear that particular line so you can show the American public, look, there's nothing to see here, et cetera, you should still do it. Like, you have too many people in this country that have certain questions. And I got to be honest, the intelligence services has shown itself to have a propensity to do stuff like this. So it's not even a situation where you could say, oh, this will never happen. It has already happened in the past. And so, yeah, I don't see any issue with asking that particular question. I mean, these are the same people who are basically asking about Trump, saying, well, hey, how will we know unless we investigate Trump and Russia? I mean, that was the stuff that they were saying. It's like, dude, you don't have anything on this. Well, no, we don't. But
we know
we just need to investigate more.
We just need to look.
Yeah.
Keep looking.
Yeah. So what about this? I mean, that guy looks extremely guilty, and yet scrubbed, hidden, pushed to the back, despite the fact that he's literally on video screaming to the hilt that we're going to invade the Capitol. I may be arrested tomorrow.
What I want to know is how many other people were doing that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Because if it's only that guy and they're not looking into it, then it's like the dog that didn't bark kind of thing, where it's like, wait, why are you guys not investigating this crucial thing that makes the most sense to investigate? Yeah. We should close it out.
Okay.
Or at least I'm down to. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break. We'll be coming back in a minute in Jamarl's Soapbox monologue segment, possibly a short back and forth between the two of us after that's done. And then we'll be speaking with a guest. That's later in the hour. You're listening to Fault Lines. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
Radio Sputnik.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the D.C. area or happen to find yourself in the D.C. area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM at 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So we're still in the shadow of the Biden-Putin virtual summit that took place day before yesterday, predominantly over the Ukraine, but there were other issues that these guys were talking about. The Ukraine issue, however, is the most fraught with danger in all of this. This is where NATO and the United States have basically took this angle and this perspective that Russia, despite being hundreds of kilometers away, without a huge force that would be necessary to invade Ukraine, is trying to potentially invade Ukraine and is potentially trying to do a coup against Ukraine and is planning to do this apparently in January and February, despite the fact that nothing on the ground looks like that or even is set up to allow that eventual reality to come about. Not to mention, it doesn't even make all that much sense. At the end of the day, there have been all sorts of condemnations back and forth. Putin making the point that this is a red line for you to put military or military armaments in Ukraine, or for that matter, make Ukraine part of NATO, be it de facto or for that matter, be it in literal sense. Biden, for his point, has been screaming that there will be severe economic consequences if you indeed invade Ukraine, despite the fact that nobody in Russia has basically said they were going to invade Ukraine. Now, they would get to that point if it became an issue where it seemed as if they were joining NATO or those red lines were breached. But up to this point, it's been somewhat of a standoff with the U.S. screaming to the hilt something that doesn't necessarily seem to be true. Not to mention, the Ukraine has half their military basically on the Donbass line. So what are we to expect of this particular situation? And what does it look like if it does get to the point where they don't get it right in regards to their analysis of events or their appraisal of how far one side is willing to go as opposed, gets it wrong? We're sleepwalking into a potential larger conflict among nuclear-powered nations. And it's dramatically problematic, to put it mildly. Putin, to his part, has basically asked for people to come together and to get assurances on this notion of no more expansion of NATO. And he has done so trying to prevent any sort of calamity that may take place at that border, considering this is their national security that's at stake. You would think that we would totally understand that, considered we were willing to end the world over weapons in Cuba being positioned several miles outside of the United States. And yet, when roles is reversed, we immediately forget that we were willing to end the world over the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we immediately turn into propaganda and all sorts of recriminations that don't necessarily exist in real world physical matter reality, but totally exists in U.S. media following the line of the political class. One of the people who basically ate this line, hook, line, and sinker, is Senator Roger Wicker. Senator Roger Wicker. This sociopath has basically come out saying that Biden should consider a nuclear first strike on Russia over the Ukraine, that it shouldn't be taken off the table, and that military action is something that potentially should be there. Let's play the clip. You think I'm joking? Not so much. Let's play the clip.
They are there, and also there's certainly nothing wrong with us, Neil, getting our troops in place in NATO countries that are treaty allies of ours. So I would be supportive of that.
Senator,
Neil, I would not rule out military action. I think we start making a mistake when we take options off the table. So I would hope the president keeps that option on the table, and to the extent that he has agreed to reverse his mistake on Nord Stream 2, if that is in fact what came out of the discussion today, I would applaud that. Hope he does it.
All right, what does military action mean, Senator?
Well, military action could mean that we stand off with our ships in the Black Sea and we rain destruction on Russian military capability. It could mean that. It could mean that we participate, and I would not rule that out. I would not rule out American troops on the ground. We don't rule out first use nuclear action. We don't think it'll happen, but there's certain things in negotiations, if you're going to be tough, that you don't take off the table. And so I think the president should say that everything is on the table. And frankly, to the extent that you had Democrats on the show right before me being quoted as saying we need to be tougher, I support that and I appreciate that. I think they represent the fear that we have, the realization that we have in the Congress, that losing a free democratic Ukraine to Russian invasion would be a game changer for a free Europe.
Losing the Ukraine would be a game changer for a free Europe. That's somewhat laughable. I mean, the point is the free democracy, or for that matter, if you want to call it that, in Ukraine was basically violently destroyed in a Western-backed coup that deposed the democratically elected government. Now, the Ukrainian government at that time was more so aligned with Russia, which the United States and NATO pretty much didn't want to tolerate, didn't tolerate, and despite the country being, this close to the Russia sphere of influence, we weren't happy with that. The thing and the ways and the permutations that we went through in order to undermine that particular government, culminating in this coup that took place that deposed the main government. What's ironic is that the democracy or the democratic aspect of this that is basically shown in the way that Ricker says it had to do with the majorities in, let's say, the breakaway regions that decided to leave, that didn't necessarily like foaming at the mouth Nazis basically being part of the organizations that undermine the government in order to allow that coup to take place. And then was part of the subsequent militias and the military working with the Ukrainian government at that particular point. There's this famous picture of John McCain standing arm in arm with people who basically lament the fact that they weren't able to join the Wehrmacht during Hitler's time, not in spite of the atrocities, but on some level because of the atrocities. Taking cues from the U.S. political and military apparatus, our media basically ignored, or largely ignored, it was one or two places, but not necessarily many places, the fact that you have these Nazi-packed militias that are working with the Ukrainian government, or for that matter, has all sorts of sway in the Ukrainian government for basic fear, legitimately so, of what would take place if there were overtures for peace in order to try to reconcile. For that matter, we ignored the torchlight ceremonies that were taking place over there. Basically a pageant of sickos harking back to what was taking place during Hitler's Nazi Germany. Apex psycho here, Wicker, and the things that he's saying are massively unhinged. And all things being equal should have been condemned just right there in this interview. You're saying you want to have a first strike? You want to rain down attacks on Russia over the Ukraine, of all things? What do you think the response would be? Do you believe that you will be able to hit each and every one of Russia's armaments where they couldn't give a response? And what do you think the response will be if the United States takes that sort of action? You're basically saying that the U.S. should get involved and fight the war on behalf of Ukraine. This stuff is just hysterical, to put it mildly. If all of these people, be it media and the political class, are perfectly okay with that coup that took place in 2014, where the elected government was basically deposed because we didn't necessarily like the way that particular government leaned, then how are you complaining about January 6th? Each and every one of these reporters and these newspapers and these articles that were written breathlessly to cry January 6th. We have a committee right now that is going through January 6th, is going to be doing it for as long as Democrats are basically in office for the next 30 years. And yet, when the same situation basically took place in Ukraine, for us, we thought that was great. Look at this uprising of democracy as the elected government basically gets destroyed and deposed. I'm making a point that if you're okay with that taking place in 2014, then how are you complaining about what took place in January 6th? Short of not necessarily having guns or snipers, you did have people fighting the authorities. You did have people who wanted to basically stop the quote-unquote steal. And you did have a president that didn't want to leave and wanted to depose the government of the United States. Both of those things are the same. It's very weird how they would look at the January 6th thing with all sorts of condemnation, shaking the fists, but they would look at the Ukrainian thing and think that's revolution. That's a replenishment of democracy, as opposed to being the undermining of a democratic system. It's very weird. I would say this, though. People like Wicker will get us into all sorts of chaos and will be the end of everything that we know of from the standpoint of America. Do you really, honestly, earnestly, and truly would like to get into a large-scale war with Russia over the Ukraine? And the answer to that should invariably, for any thinking, rational human being, should be no. Shane, what are your thoughts? Wicker is basically saying Biden should consider a first strike on Russia. And not just necessarily a first strike, he even evokes nuclear weapons in the context of that conversation. And basically saying we should potentially rain down destruction on Russia, as if there's no response to that. Meaning, like, what does he think? Play that out. You decide that you want to rain down destruction over the Ukraine. Okay, great. You've instigated yourself in a war with Russia over the Ukraine. Something that basically Russia is not prepared to invade the Ukraine. Doesn't look like they are anyway. It seems Ukraine is more poised to kind of take over the other regions. And so you're basically setting up your framing of the world based on the way that media has omitted context and information for this particular story. And has gone so far, jumping the shark, that you've basically said we should attack Russia over this. Stuff is unhinged. What are your thoughts?
For one thing, I really like your comparison. I think that the comparison of what happened on January 6th to the 2013, 2014 Euromaidan process, but specifically what happened on the public square there and the taking over, the deposing, and just a couple month period there, not the whole national revolution there, but in Kiev. Very appropriate and good comparison to make. That's just, I like the way that you did that.
Thank you.
Props, hats off to you with that one.
Basically the same. I mean, it's short of fighting cops as opposed to shooting. I mean, you basically have something that's a march on the Capitol for all intents and purposes. And what Trump wanted to do was basically stop this. We want to stop the forward progression of this particular country. I want to be in charge. It seemed very similar to me in regards to the dynamics. The outcome was different, but we love the outcome in one, hate the outcome in the other. Yeah. It's just very weird.
Well, real quick comments. We have our guest on the line, I think, and so I will try to be brief because I don't want to take up too much time, clearly. I'll be talking with Dr. Mikhail Kogan, by the way, about COVID-19. But just briefly on this one, a lot of different angles. The one that I'll use for now is Roger Wicker, the senator who made these comments, GOP senator from Mississippi. For one thing, he wouldn't, said, I don't know. My mind, Mississippi is not in the first blast zone for a nuclear war with Russia. So he doesn't particularly have his own skin in the game. Yeah. Another thing that comes to mind is for members of the public, most people don't care. They don't know the details. They don't know the history. They don't care about it because it's taking place in the other side of the earth. What they do care about is like America and America standing up for itself. And, America's sort of reputation, place in the world, I think something like that. I think people have this sense of that, and, in terms of how America's doing. And, okay, if we're getting into it with other countries, are we taking it from them? Are we in a position where we're supine and they're just running over us all the time? That's the kind of thing that I feel like when it comes to foreign policy, people are thinking about. They're like, okay, are we standing up for ourselves in the world stage? Yeah. And on this issue, if it gets portrayed to the American public convincingly that, Russia is intimidating us, Russia is aggressing, and we just need to stand up, for ourselves and with our Ukrainian allies. That's the way the media is presenting it. That's the way the media is presenting it. Now, the question is, if we were to get into some outright war, would the journalism be good enough, or would it be co-opted enough on the other end that we hear or don't hear about the truth about what happened? I think that... You already know that answer. I think that fairly quickly the truth would start to come out, actually. You think so? I think that fairly quickly the truth would start to come out. When I say fairly quickly, I mean within like a couple of years. And it would be an absolute disaster as it does. Oh, you mean after everything is... After everything. Okay. But here's the thing, man. Depending on what we're talking about, unless we're talking about another restricted proxy war in the context of Ukraine where we're which is terrible. Mm-hmm. He's talking about a nuclear strike. Yeah. Which is an armed World War III kind of a scenario. It really depends. None of it's good, but I'm thinking, okay, if this escalates and gets really bad, if it's not just us arming the Kiev side, Russia arming the Donbass side, we have some troops on the ground providing assistance support, but mostly it's artillery fire and Ukrainians dying as opposed to Americans dying and Russians dying. He said us. He said us. Yeah, and that's the next on Russia. Escalatory step that I was getting to is if the American sense is, this is just a case where we're having to stand up for ourselves, I hope and think that actually would start to wither after a little while. And what it would come out is Roger Wicker and people like him, they're not patriots. They're not standing up for their constituents or for the spirit of America or anything like that. They're bought into a narrative, or they're not even that, or they're just military industrial complex flunkies, whatever, doing the work. I guess that's how I sort of see this thing, and I feel like there's a narrative change that could happen when the truth starts to come out about this story, if it comes out. If we get into some conflict. I'm just trying to play this out a couple of iterations, maybe 6 months, a year, something like that, and seeing what happens. And for the people who are trying to initiate a war, I don't think it looks good, because if they were to look into the facts, if they don't already know them about how this stuff all started, 2013, 2014, the most recent iteration of this conflict, in terms of the breakup of the country right now, as they learn about it, the politicians and the public, they would realize that we're in the wrong in the majority of the positions in this situation. And, that's not a good defensible position. But has it protected us in the war in Afghanistan or war in Iraq or any of these other wars that we've gotten into? Not so much. No, but... I mean, it seems we forget it almost immediately the way we learn it. I mean, because it also seems like we're getting more critical of our wars as time goes on, too. And maybe I'm wrong about that. I think that's fair. No, I think that's fair. I think the thing is, though, it's like the Iraq war, missiles, weapons, mass destruction, and everything else, it was years after the war where people were like, oh, wait, this was a mistake. And so, it's like at some point that stuff started to funnel through, but
It takes a while, but maybe, man, we'll see. I mean, I just think it's so disastrous.
Yeah.
And maybe because it's so disastrous, the truth will filter in that much faster as opposed to the way it is.
I went a little bit long. We went back and forth a little bit. We should go to our guest. We'll be joined when we come back by Dr. Jamarl Thomas talking about COVID-19, getting an update on this new Omicron variant. Yeah, we're going to be talking about a couple more things, too. Also immunity, which we wanted to talk about with, well, Dr. Kogan himself brought it up last time. We talked about this a little bit before, but it's good when you're dealing with this virus. Of course, you get vaccinated. You know, there's this new medications coming out, but the baseline for dealing with any medical disease, no. The majority of medical diseases, as far as I can tell, you can help yourself by improving the quality of your body, by improving your immunity, by improving the resiliency in terms of what you eat, how you live, reducing stress, those kinds of factors. And so just in general, we like to talk with Dr. Jamarl Thomas about that every couple of months, but he brought it up specifically with this new Omicron variant. If you're worried about this, if you're thinking, what should I be doing? Is this something to be worried about? Is this something to even be excited about? The answer is the same. Take care of yourself, and we'll be talking about how with Dr. Jamarl Thomas when we come back. You're listening to Fault Lines. Be back in just a minute.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones? With the historical context to tie them together, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. The information for Omicron is still coming out, and it's too early to know exactly whether or not it's that much more contagious, even though we believe it is, or for that matter, that much worse in regards to symptoms. This is one of those things that we're basically still learning. However, scientists from South Africa, growing live samples of the Omicron variant, performed lab tests to see if it was affected by antibodies in the blood sample. Now, this was somewhat of a small test, but what they found, based on the study, is somewhat worrying, to put it mildly. The study was the first to show that Omicron compares to the previous variants, such as Beta and Delta, on a level playing field. It shows that the antibodies in the blood samples were 41 times less effective for Omicron than it was for the 2020 strains. Now, the catch here is if Omicron is less, let's say, lethal and less severe in regards to the symptoms, is this the potential for COVID to be on its way out? To have a conversation about, despite the antibody lessening effect. To have a conversation about this, we're joined with Dr. Jamarl Thomas. Dr. Jamarl Thomas is medical director at the George Washington Center for Integrative Medicine, associate professor of medicine at George Washington University, and founder and executive director of AIM Health Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit delivering integrative services to the underserved. Dr. Jamarl Thomas, how are you doing this morning? Are you doing all right?
Good morning. Yeah, doing pretty well. Thank you.
Excellent. So this new study, how should we frame this? And I'll just read it again. It says the new study is the first to show how Omicron compares to the previous variants, such as Beta and Delta, on a level playing field, and the preliminary data shows antibodies in the blood samples are 41 times less effective for Omicron than it was for the 2020 strains. Now, just because the antibodies were less effective, this kind of, I guess, gets into transmissibility and those type of things. There were all sorts of mutations associated with Omicron that gave this hint that it was probably far more transmissible. But transmissibility doesn't necessarily mean that it's worse in regards to the effects that it has on the person. It could be a milder form of COVID. Either way, how should we frame, or how should we think about the 41 times depreciation and effectiveness of antibodies as compared to the ones prior?
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's definitely more transmissible. In lab studies, by the way, you have to be careful because you don't know 100% how that translates to an actual clinical scenario. But most likely it's much more transmissible. We do know that the numbers are rising very quickly, suggestive of pretty high infectivity rate, and moreover, it does appear that in the areas where the infection starts spreading, the Delta variant goes down, which is sort of what I talked a little bit about last week, or whenever we talked last, which is indeed suggests that it's a milder form. Now, the only other clinical data we currently have about being more mild form is the small study coming out from Epicenter in South Africa from local hospital where they analyzed 38 cases. What was really important is that most of those cases inside the hospital were not coming to the hospital because of COVID. They were coming for some unrelated conditions and just were found coincidentally to have COVID, so meaning they had no symptoms whatsoever. And then only out of all those patients who presented, there were only 9 patients with any kind of pulmonary symptoms. In contrast, let's say Delta, you have almost universally the virus was affecting pulmonary system and causing pneumonia, and that was the kind of the main cause of mortality and morbidity is when the COVID was hitting the lungs, and then it was leading to what's called ARDS.
But wait, hang on a second there. I just want to pause for a second because Delta, as far as I know, I might be misunderstanding you, but it's not like 100% of the people, from my understanding, who catch Delta get really sick with it, which it sounds like you were kind of saying there.
Sure. No, but I'm saying for people who were presenting to the hospital with Delta, sicker, right? So
yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Right. We talked about 38 people who were in the hospital who were found to have Delta, and what's really good is that most of them didn't even have the actual symptoms. They just were coming to the hospital for unrelated reasons. Now, that's reassuring. It's not enough data, but it's really reassuring. It's the first actual clinical data of any kind of systemic observation versus what we had last week was just local doctors were saying, look, we're not seeing as much of the severe illness as we were seeing with Delta. So that's another good news. Now, we obviously have to wait longer. We have to wait for a clear data also on what impact is on more high-risk populations. So, patients who have chronic medical problems, people who are older, people who have some kind of immune deficiency, regardless of the reason. So we don't know whether that's still going to be severe enough to cause really severe illness. So sort of we have to wait. In terms of a couple of quick updates on vaccines, the Pfizer, now it's internal data. We have to see whether that internal data will translate to clinical data, but it's their internal data looking at the 2 versus 3 vaccines in the lab. They took a blood from people who had either 2 or 3, and then they looked at the impact of the antibodies from the blood on the new variant, and it looked like that the 3rd vaccine had somewhere in the magnitude of 20 to 25 times stronger impact or protective impact. Now, will that translate to a clinical protection? I guess everybody should say yes, but we have to wait and see. Again, it's not 100% clear. So those are some of the key updates, I think. Now, of course, everybody should be excited about the fact that Pfizer stated that they should have, it's a formal official statement, that they should have the Omicron-specific data or Omicron-specific form of vaccine coming out in March next year. So hopefully that will be really good news. And apparently that vaccine obviously going to be way more effective against the new variant compared to the currently what we have. But even if the 3rd dose appears to be much more protective, I'm assuming that we're going to have even more push to get the boosters all around. So, and lastly, I want to say, I guess you guys heard about this new stealth variant. So apparently there's a sub strain of Omicron that mutated the portion that the PCR epidemiologic test is targeting. So, the way all strains get discovered is there's a particular PCR test, which is not usually implemented for clinical purposes. It takes longer, it's more expensive, so it's just used for research. And apparently this subvariant mutated the area to which PCR primer was targeted. So it's not discoverable by the regular technology. So they're kind of very rapidly changing what they're doing to figure out how to test for it. Because, if you missed the diagnostic test on somebody, that's a big problem because your statistics completely get upset, and we won't even know what % of all the Omicron infected individuals have this new variant. So we may actually underestimate significantly the presence of real disease in the population. Now, it's not even clear if this new subvariant any more infectious or any more causes any more disease than the other one. You know, this is all data just coming out this week.
Wow. So, wow. Okay. You mentioned this notion that it increases. I think the word you use is protective impact. What does that mean? What are the mechanics of that? Are you just talking about the level of antibodies that are increased when?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just the level of antibodies. Because think about it. They can only measure certain things in terms of immune tests in the blood. So the levels of antibodies always thought to be the number one way to assess the strength of protection. That's what they did. So they just assessed the amount of antibodies present in the blood of the people who had 2 or 3 Pfizer shots.
Is that adequate to know whether or not it's protective? I hope that makes sense. You kind of made the point of saying, you know, this is what it looks like in the lab, but we don't necessarily know how this translates into reality per se. And well, let's just be more basic. How do antibodies protect the person from a particular virus in the first place, where the number of antibodies is this kind of correlation with how protected or how secure a particular individual may be from getting the illness?
Right. That's a great way to start segueing into just general conversation about immunity and talking about particularly specifically this antibody response. So what happens is, let's take first scenario when the person has a good, robust protection because they have a lot of antibodies for a particular problem. Let's just talk about the COVID in this case, regardless of particular strain. So if you have enough antibodies, what happens is you're binding the antibodies quickly to whatever came in. So let's say you have, I don't know, 1 billion copies of virus that you inhaled, and all of them get antibodies attached. So that means that the immune system, the cellular function, so the cells of the immune system, going to recognize those antibodies on top of the virus, and they're going to immediately trigger next step of immune response and clear those viruses that are attached to the antibody. I'm simplifying it, obviously, but it's a bit more complicated. But that's really in short. If somebody does not have antibodies, so let's say a patient was not vaccinated, and never had a disease. So what happens is the body has to make those antibodies. So it has to first recognize there's a problem, then make the antibodies, etc. It's too long, so it's not happening. So then there's the next levels of protection when antibodies cannot be made. It's a more of a cellular response, but it takes a lot longer. So if you at risk for more severe illness, that initial clearance doesn't happen. When we say that vaccine protects us primarily from severe illness, that's exactly what it means, because you do have some escape, but it's very mild. And most of the virus gets cleared up pretty quickly. Your illness doesn't progress to be severe. Now, of course, the hope initially was that everything will get cleared and then you don't even become infectious and you don't infect others. So unfortunately, as we all quite know by now, this was an unfulfilled dream that we're not going to get to. But nonetheless, it does appear that, including the Omicron, the vaccine is able to cause enough antibody levels staying in the system for a good chunk of time, let's say 6 months. Although, again, that precise timing, that's another really important point. Let me segue for a second. So how long do the antibodies stay in the blood or stay in the system? Well, it actually depends on the particular antibody. There are some, I'm more familiar with allergies specifically, let's say some food allergies. Certain antibodies can stay up for, say, 8 to 12 weeks, being a half-life, and means that in 8 weeks, if you started with X, you now have half X antibodies for a particular problem. Now, it's not really clear exactly how to calculate this length because it heavily depends on how your immune system generally works. So in somebody who's immune suppressed, that half-life is going to be a lot shorter. And so, after 2, 3, 4, 5 half-lives, you get so little antibodies left that, the protection starts to wean off, and eventually it's almost going to be like as if you never had a shot or you never had the illness. So sometimes antibodies stay up really long time. So there are certain illnesses, for example, measles would be a good example, or shingles, the antibodies, herpes zoster, the antibodies can stay in the blood for years and years. So actually, a patient recently asked me, so why can't they make a shot that antibodies will stay up for years? It's just not that simple, because you can't really very well predict how long that's going to last. We do know that for certain types of rapidly mutating viruses, those antibodies simply cannot stay very long. If the virus mutates, your antibody was to a prior version of the virus, not to the new one. They just stop working altogether because they're just to a different organism, all in all. But it still remains to be determined whether the actual half-life is also shorter, because that also can happen. So not all the protective antibodies will indeed last for years and years. Some don't last that long. They just wean down faster. And that's way over my pay grade, by the way. Like, that's the level of immunology that I don't fully understand. And, we need to bring PhD in immunology to explain to us why certain antibodies last 10 years and some will only last, 6 months or so.
We have a guy on call sometimes, not on call, but we have a guy that we bring on as a guest sometimes who comes to mind to be able to potentially answer that question. So if we get an answer from him, I'll relay it to you, or maybe we could have you on at the same time. I don't know. I'm going to pivot very slightly here. I want to move towards immunity, but I also want to briefly, while we're heading there, and it is a natural segue, I think, talk about the hesitancy that a lot of people have towards vaccines as they consider what the appropriate response is. If they're thinking about the virus at all, those who are like COVID skeptics or whatever, to the extent that they're not just rejecting the idea that it exists or is a threat to them, they're like, okay, maybe it's not a threat to me, maybe it's a threat to close family members, that kind of thing. Say they don't want to get a vaccine. Say I'm presenting a patient, an imaginary patient to you, Dr. Kogan. Say you have somebody who comes in, maybe you've known them for a little while, they kind of like you, they trust you a bit, but they're also very skeptical of these vaccines. And they're like, they haven't gotten any. And now they're hearing about this booster shot and the Omicron variant and how, okay, you need to get a third shot for it. Now, next year with the next variant, you need to give me a fourth shot or a fifth. Well, they have that kind of skepticism. What does this actually mean? And they're coming to you. They're asking, what would you recommend that I do? I'm curious, in terms of the vaccine conversation, but also the other responses, how would you counsel them? What advice would you give them, Dr. Kogan?
Well, also, just first thing before I try to answer this, it really depends who's in front of me also on individual level, right? So I don't give the same exact answer to everybody.
Totally.
If I have a 65-year-old skeptic with cancer in front of me, my conversation may be a lot harder. I may push this person aggressively to get the shot simply because I know the possible consequences. So, if I tell this person statistics, my statistics to this person should be different, right? Because I can't simply...
I'll fill it in for you, because I'll say they're 40s, 50s, relatively low risk other than that. Really decently active lifestyle, no serious medical problems, nothing like diabetes or anything like that. But they're, 40s, 50s.
Well, so 40s, 50s, and then you have to dig a lot deeper. Do they have vitamin D deficiency, right? How do they respond to other viruses?
Yeah.
This is the difference where kind of a more precision, more integrative approach. I don't look at two individuals even who appear to be totally similar, same age, same sex, same education. I'm not going to look at them the same exact way.
Valid. What I'm curious about specifically is I know there are a lot of people who are in broadly that camp. And to give you full disclosure, there's not any specific person in my mind. It's not like I'm asking on behalf of a relative. But I'm curious both in terms of what advice you'd give them on the vaccine, knowing that they're kind of skeptical of it, whether they should get it, would you try to convince them? And then just outside of that, what would you recommend they prioritize their attention on, Dr. Kogan?
So first I will test them. I'll get, do they have a sense of severities? Like, do they understand the statistics? Can they separate the difference? Meaning, we know that if you get shot, you dramatically drop statistics. You have a little bit of chances of some side effects. Some of them could be more severe. Some of them could be more mild. So I get a sense, how realistic are they? Because a lot of people will say, if I get the illness, I get mild illness. That's what will happen to me. But if I get the shot, I have someone totally high unrealistic percentage of getting Bell's palsy or dying from the shot, right? So if they unrealistic, I'll try to reason with them to a point where, if I feel that they're just not registering, okay. Yeah. But, I'll sense, do they understand the difference? Now, if they fully understand the difference, but the hesitancy comes from something in particular, like, they had somebody in their family had a bad experience with the vaccine, or a friend, or they simply just don't believe that they will get sick. I mean, there are people like that. They truly don't believe they're going to get sick. They say, oh, no, if I get it, it'll be mild. Well, so then you have to dig into that. Like, okay, I hear you, but are you going to take her, like, who do you live with? Are you in contact with people who are potentially at much higher risk? What kind of work you do? I mean, can you be out of work for 2, 3, 4 weeks? And are you okay to have severe cognitive problems after things like this? And you start just kind of talking. So my style is not to just give them a data and say, now make a decision and that's it. No, if I have 10, 15 minutes, I'm going to dig into it. I'm going to investigate what they know. I'm going to tell them what I know, and we're going to talk. I think that the most of the change gets implemented when you simply discuss it. You don't push. You don't say you have to get it. There are situations where that works, to be honest with you. Like, I have few patients who trust me to the point where they say, whatever you say, I will do. But I'll tell you, that's a minority of and I'm sure it's not just it has nothing to do with just who I am. It's just this is how human psyche works. But there are people like that, and so for those people, I have responsibility to tell them I think you should get a shot. Usually, most of the time. But everybody else, unless they're like really, really healthy and they're live in complete isolation, and then I have to be truthful. So that's another thing. You have to be honest. Like, you have to give information, but you shouldn't manipulate the data. You shouldn't try to twist their arm because you know better. Like, that is a bad practice, because people will sense it always. They will understand that you're trying to implement your own agenda on them. No, that's one of the key things of a good doctoring is you keep it as honest as possible. You express your opinion, but you don't express it based on, oh my God, you're a bad person. Like, why didn't you take it? It's not ethically appropriate. It's simply not a good doctoring. You have to give the person chance to make their own decisions simply, if any other reason, but the fact that, ultimately they are responsible for their life, not us. And it gets more complicated with kids. And for me, it's very active and not an easy issue. We talked about this and can talk more if needed. But to me, that's very different from when I'm in the room with the adult.
I'm curious, have you found yourself having a lot of these conversations, and what has been the effect of it? Meaning, like, not necessarily browbeating people into doing X or Y, like getting a vaccination or something to that effect. But have you found that the people who you've been having these conversations with have been receptive to the conversation? And what has been the thing that you've noticed? And that's assuming you've noticed anything in these conversations that have had a certain resonance, meaning something that comes up that they seem to be more receptive to in regards to the argument that you're making about the vaccinations.
People who are more receptive tend to be people who are very interested in listening to data. They have good analytical capacity. They can compare the data, and people who are able to screen out the noise. The problems that I have the most are people who can't screen out the noise. Like, people will read something on Facebook, go research this, meaning read more Facebook, right, usually, or Google or whatever, right? And then the next thing, they read 10 articles saying that vaccine is going to kill you, or that Bill Gates going to put the microchip in your blood. And the problem with that is, obviously they can't necessarily even effectively read it, but put that aside, your psyche starts to believe in something regardless of what your analytical capacity is going to do. And you're just going to find evidence to support what you're saying. You may not even be able to understand that the evidence is manipulated or whatnot. But
you don't put it into context. You just sort of go down whatever rabbit hole you were led into, but whatever first thing you saw, and then you confirmation bias a whole narrative out of it, that kind of thing.
People who are in that rabbit hole, most of the time I can't get out of that.
It's hard. It's hard to get out of that one, speaking from experience. Dr. McKelk-Hogan, thank you for joining us this morning. Dr. McKelk-Hogan, for everybody listening, medical director at the George Washington Center for Integrative Medicine. We're closing this hour out. We'll be back in a minute with headlines. Be right back.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am your ever vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And over here on the radically independent side of things, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That would mean you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Right on, let's get into the headlines. Yesterday, or I should say in the news, yesterday in the United States, there were 149,041 new COVID cases reported, along with 1,851 new deaths. Wow. Over the past week, there's been an average of about 121,311 cases per day, an increase of 27% from the average 2 weeks ago. 60% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 71% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 49,505,304 people across the United States and has killed an unfortunate 791,933 men, women, and children in America. In national news, President Joe Biden is set to participate in a virtual Summit for Democracy from the White House beginning today, where he'll host more than 100 participants representing government, civil society, and private sector leaders. The summit has been billed as an opportunity to collaborate on fighting corruption and promoting respect for human rights. However, the gathering already has drawn backlash from the United States' chief adversaries and other nations that were not invited to participate. The ambassadors to the United States from China and Russia wrote a joint essay in the National Interest Policy Journal describing the Biden administration as exhibiting a Cold War mentality that will stoke up ideological confrontation and a rift in the world. Literally considering. The governors of Maine and New York deployed the National Guard in response to dangerously low capacity at statewide medical facilities due to the pandemic. The New York National Guard announced Wednesday that it had deployed 120 medics and medical technicians to a dozen long-term care facilities statewide. The deployment came at the behest of Governor Kathy Hochul, who issued the order last week in response to staffing shortages. I want to come back to that. I mean, because we just passed, nearly a $700 billion military bill over the course of the year. And when you think about it, it's like, what country are we having a fight with where we need to have this massive budget? And this is while we're still in the middle of a pandemic. And based upon some of these states don't even have the bandwidth to even deal with the pandemic as it is proper. I mean, and these guys are talking about, okay, well, we need to ramp up in the money that we're spending.
Get into another war.
Yeah, it's just wild stuff. We're in a war. I mean, we've had nearly 800,000 people drop dead over the course of a year and a half. That is larger than the wars that we've basically fought in. I mean, it's just obscene, honestly.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. All right, let's keep going. Former Trump White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows is suing the House Select Committee investigating January 6th, modestly investigating January 6th, and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi asking a federal court to block enforcement of the subpoena the committee issued him, as well as a subpoena it issued to Verizon for his phone records, according to the complaint filed on Wednesday. The lawsuit comes after the committee signaled it would pursue a criminal contempt referral against Meadows because of his refusal to sit down for a deposition in the investigation in the Capitol riot. Meadows alleges that the subpoenas are overly broad and unduly burdensome, while claiming that the committee, quote, lacks lawful authority to seek and obtain, unquote, the information requested. I agree with you, Shane. The more I read the story and I think about the story, yeah, I agree. I mean, we'll come back to it. But it's just, it seems like it's a fishing expedition. I need to see all of your records on these days for the last 6 months. What?
Man,
what are you talking about? What do you mean you need to see all of my records?
That's the kind of thing that they will ask for, but it's like a pretty hardball question. It's like an antagonistic request from the prosecution.
Because we know most of that stuff is not going to have anything to do with January 6th.
Yeah.
I totally agree with you. I mean, this was the thing they did with Donziger, where the judge was like, we need to see your communications, et cetera. And, you have attorney-client privilege, and they're basically saying we need to breach attorney-client privilege, and we want all of this data. And his point was, I I can't give you that. What does it mean for my clients who I work with if you're receiving and looking at basically the conversations we're having back and forth? Like, you're trying to get the laptops, you're trying to get all of this other information. It seems overly broad. And it's one of those things where it's almost used as a pretext to put him in jail. I mean, it's
in the case
something
of
you know he can't do.
Well, it's different because in the case of Donziger, of course, there is the attorney-client privilege thing that, of course, is particular to him as an attorney.
That's true.
And it's not shared by Mark Meadows. But what does Mark Meadows have? Well, whatever he's been talking about, whatever he was talking about at the time, I'm sure Adam Schiff and Democrats and turncoat Republicans on this committee, and it's like Liz Cheney,
that's pretty much it, if I'm not mistaken. They want their hands on that stuff.
They want their hands on that stuff because it gives them a perfect window into what's going on in Trump's camp.
Yeah.
And not, what's going on over on that wing of things, both back then and you just during the whole period covered. To the extent that Mark Meadows is in touch with people and talking to them, that would give them, first access to it, which strategically gives them so much leverage. But that's not, of course, how we're hearing about the story. And Mark Meadows contesting it, saying, no, don't look into all my records, is going to be portrayed by the left media, the left MSM media. What are you trying to hide? Exactly. Yeah. Well, why are you trying to? What were you doing on January 6th?
Yeah.
That's where it leads, and it's sickening if you actually think about it. Because guess what? That's how democracy dies. There are different ways that we don't notice that are really bad for democracy. Mm-hmm. Things that happen just kind of out in public, like hidden in plain sight. Mm-hmm. And this is one of them, right?
Opposition youth going on fishing expeditions.
Fishing expeditions out in public, and then, you can just see how this plays out. It's just terrible. Anyway, you got more headlines, but just pausing on it for a second.
Agreed. As I read, I was like, Shane's right about this one. But the Senate will begin considering the bill on Thursday that would create a fast-track process allowing Democrats to raise the federal debt limit without votes from Republicans. A crucial next step as lawmakers race the clock to avert disaster of a debt ceiling default. A first-ever default would trigger financial disaster, and the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, has warned the debt limit could be reached on December 15th, leaving little time left to act. Party leaders on both sides of the aisle have made it clear that the default must be prevented, but Republicans have insisted that Democrats should bear the entire burden of raising the limit on their own. And that's basically what this bill basically allows. It's an up and down vote that would allow the Democrats to basically use all 50 and Kamala Harris to raise the debt ceiling. McConnell wants them to take it all, basically. Evergrande, the embattled Chinese property developer, has defaulted on its debt, according to Fitch Ratings. The credit ratings agency on Thursday downgraded the company and its subsidiaries to, quote, restricted default, unquote, meaning that the firm has failed to meet its financial obligations.
Real quick, what implications does that have for China's economy, or for the world economy for that matter? Because, when this issue was coming up in a big way a couple months ago, the thing was, it's not just the investors getting defrauded. Mm-hmm. It's what whiplash is that going to have on, is that going to lead to a world recession? Yeah. It was like at that level. So is that just noise, or what are we going to see here?
I got to be honest, I don't know. I don't know the gravity or how significant Evergrande is. Like, if somebody would have said, is Bear Stearns collapsing going to create this kind of financial hurricane of sorts? I don't know if anybody would have known the answer to that. It's kind of, ultimately it did, as this stuff tumbled down.
We'll see. A lot of people were predicting that would be a big
issue per se.
Like, pulling out a key block in the Jenga that is China's, they perceive as China's economy or whatever, and it all comes tumbling down because it's, you get what I'm saying. That's how they saw the defaulting of Evergrande, the implications of that. Well, if we see that happening, they'll be right. If we don't, they'll be wrong. Something to remember either way.
Yeah, I just don't know the scale of Evergrande and how it's plugged into the rest of the Chinese economy in a way where I can predict one way or the other about it. But
and to be clear,
wait and see.
I don't think it's going to collapse the entire Chinese economy.
I don't buy that.
We'll see specifically what happens.
But I feel you. In sports news, the Arizona Coyotes of the National Hockey League could potentially be without access to their home arena later this month if delinquent taxes and back rent aren't paid, according to a letter sent from the team owner. Sent to the team owner from Glendale city manager Kevin Phelps. In holiday news, today is National Llama Day, nice, National Pastry Day, Tanzania Independence Day. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. There's another story I want to hit to that I thought was utterly funny, entirely pathetic. For the first time, Hillary Clinton publicly delivers her victory speech that would have been given in 2016.
That is sad.
Now, thank you. That's what I was like. I don't know if this is sad or funny or a little bit of both. But if you think about it, how many other failed presidents, people who failed to be president, that part, give a victory speech after they basically don't secure the victory. And especially 5 years after the fact, meaning she's not just lost. The person who won did that 4 years, and now we're in an entirely new presidency, and now they're still like, hey, Hillary, you want to give your speech? Sure, I'll give my speech. Why? Who cares about what she's saying in a speech of things that she wouldn't have enacted, even if she did win, and certainly is never going to get the power to enact now? Meaning whatever platitudes she was going to give that didn't necessarily mean one way or the other, I wouldn't have wanted to hear it then if she won. I certainly don't want to hear it now, where she has zero power whatsoever to do anything about it. And considering the number of people who were part of that slush fund Clinton Foundation, basically those foreign investors basically went away overnight at the point where she didn't win because, well, she doesn't have the political influence. We can't do the I scratch your back, you scratch mine. So there's no point in basically putting money into the foundation, right? It's like if I can't get anything out of it, which was the point, then yeah, there's no point in me contributing to this. This just seems sad. Like, I don't think I would do this, even if I had the opportunity to do this. It's almost like somebody, like you going into interrogation, and it's like, I heard you're a rapper. Spit some rhymes for us. It feels a little bit like that, where it's like, okay, dude, I'm not going to sully myself. I'm entertaining for your benefit. Have more dignity about yourself, Hillary. Don't let them do this to you. That looks very sad.
I don't know if it's them doing it to her.
You think it's hurt, like her ego is like, I just want to give my speech. It just seems so pathetic to give your speech 5 years later, a victory speech after you've lost.
I think that was a speech that she put a lot of work into and that she was looking forward to giving for her entire life. And there's a teen-aged girl in her or something like that like had been working really hard on that and wanted to give it and felt like it was stolen from her back in 2016 because internally she was able to blame it on the Russians.
Yeah.
I don't know. And maybe she is bad faith, but I feel like there's a good faith interpretation of Hillary Clinton where she just has managed to psychopathically convince herself of all these things, you know, and she's living it out.
Maybe. If she's doing that, yeah, she has certain issues.
But then why else would she be doing this, Jamarl?
I don't know. I mean, I know sometimes media have this kind of weird infatuation with her just because they hate Trump so much. And so it's like, because I got to be honest, I don't know any other person who's lost and then later on anybody cared what they were going to say as a victory speech. I mean, it's like, all things being equal, you would think that the speech that the president gives after they win sets the tone for their administration going forward. Like, this is what I am, this is what I'm going to do.
But for her followers probably would agree with her that, it was just stolen from her. That 2016 was, they threw to
Trump and those Russians.
Yeah. So for them, they might not see it as sad. They might see it as, they might see it, sad in another way. Not sad.
What opportunity we've missed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The book Shattered was phenomenal. Have you read that book?
No, I haven't.
All right. So the book Shattered was based on this notion of all of the people when Hillary Clinton lost. Because on the night that Hillary Clinton lost that race, she had a 98% chance of winning. It was something to that effect. Like, they were like, Hillary Clinton has a 98% chance. And then over the course of the night, as she lose state after state after state, the number would just, until it flipped over to Trump. Well, those people who thought almost in the way of breath to lungs, she's going to win this. There is no chance that she's going to lose this. I had Democrats working at the office that I was working at who would wag their finger at me because I was a Bernie Sanders supporter. It's like, you got to get on the page, man. You got to get on the page. She's going to win this. And I made a bet with them. And dude was like, she's going to win by 300 votes, etc. And I said, all right, I'll make a deal with you. If Hillary wins, and let's say it's over 300, I will wear a Hillary shirt. If she loses, you need to wear a Bernie shirt. She lost that race. Do you know that guy didn't wear the shirt?
He didn't wear the shirt?
Didn't wear the shirt.
That
Chris
coward.
Rand. I would invoke his name. Chris Rand.
You didn't even ask him to wear like a Trump shirt, which is the real thing
I even bought him the shirt. I even bought him a T-shirt. It's a bam.
You even bought him the shirt.
Even bought him the T-shirt. All of them were hurting. It looked like you had like sex with somebody who you couldn't stand after a drunken night where you couldn't even look at each other in the morning. It was kind of like that morning where I didn't know what to expect because Trump was in. I didn't vote for Clinton at all. I thought she was going to lose, but it's weird. It's almost like, all right, I don't see how she win this just looking at the way that the numbers are going. And the fact that Obama and these guys are going to Wisconsin is a horrible sign. Like, day before the election, these guys are going to Wisconsin. You don't have Wisconsin in the bag already? You're like, meaning you got something showing that you may lose that particular state, a state that you guys have basically won for God knows how long. And so for me, I was like, I don't see how she wins it. By the same token, something in me was like, there's no way she's going to lose it. Like, I couldn't fathom the notion that Trump wins it, even though I couldn't see on the paper how he loses
I
it.
can totally, yeah. The night of, I remember exactly where I was and what I was doing when I found out that Trump won. And it was like a little bit of shock and a little bit of surprise, but it was much more surprising to see Trump win, of course, than it was to see Hillary lose.
Right.
Because it's not like Hillary losing, but it's more like, wow, we have Trump.
Yeah.
Reality star, TV show, real estate, but mostly, real estate tycoon too, but mostly I just think of him in terms of The Apprentice. And I remember the night of 2016, I'm hanging out with my friends Chris and Pat in Southern California, driving around, and we're like, and Chris specifically, Pat was wise up. He was like, he knew what was going to happen. Yeah. He was calling it all day. And then Chris was like, along with me, just kind of jaw slack. Wait, what? Really? Yeah. Wow, we have Trump for president. And Chris was a little bit, we were both kind of negative about it because, of course, Trump was crazy.
What was California like? I mean, California is a blue state. Like
we went out to a bar. Yeah. We went out to a bar, and
were there people crying?
Pat specifically, who was the one who wasn't surprised by it, he got to talking with people, and they were all completely shocked. Yeah. And he was trying to explain to them, you got to understand, there are a lot of people in America who, haven't been, he was having this whole conversation, I remember, just like listening to him, trying to explain it. And I got where he was coming from. Yeah. They clearly didn't. And there was just this massive impasse.
Hillary Clinton is great. I don't see why anybody has issues with Hillary Clinton.
It didn't turn into a screaming match, though. If he was tactful enough with these conversations that it's not like they got into a fight over it. He was just trying to explain it. But yeah, Californians were truly shocked, along with myself and my friend Chris, of course.
There were a lot of people that were shocked. Like I said, I didn't think she was going to win. And because I couldn't see the numbers. Like, they had this application where you can put in, like, okay, if Hillary Clinton takes this state or that state, or Donald Trump takes this. And as you're getting it, you go to Maine and you're like, well, I don't know if she can take Maine. And I don't think they're going to take Wisconsin just because of these guys going up. And after a while, you get to this like number that's really close to one another.
Yeah.
And it's like, all right, if she loses that state, she can't make it. Maybe she can win it. But it became like that. It was very, very close. And so I didn't necessarily know what many of these people were saying when it was like, oh, she's going to win that. It's not going to be close, et cetera. Yeah. Didn't happen that way.
Whatever mistake like the 538 crowd was making, and I wasn't paying as close attention to the 2016 election as I was to the 2021. Yeah. I think because I'd been working on politics and I was just like tired of it. I'd been working on journalism stuff with my dad on and off for a while. And so I was like at that specific time. But whatever mistake the 538 crowd was making,
Nate Silver.
Yes. Nate Silver and his crowd was making, and that the rest, I'm not trying to just point them out, but they were the like trusted arbiters of this process in terms of predicting it. That's the kind of mistake that we should all watch out for. You know what I mean? Because it's such a huge one where they were all so certain of it. Certain of this
big guy can win.
Big political event. Yeah. And it's the kind of mistake where if they had scratched at the surface of it in key ways, they would have quickly realized that they were wrong, but they didn't, and they deceived themselves. And then, they, to their shame, my point is, that's the real mistake. That's the doozy of a mistake that if you make it, you should not make it. You got to figure out how to prevent that mistake from coming to pass.
And then, of course, Democrats turned around and really understood why all these people voted for Hillary. They didn't do that at all. They said they were sexist, racist, bigoted, et cetera, et cetera.
They made the worst mistake, which is not learning the lesson.
Not learning the lesson and then screaming Russia and Trump. I mean, it's like, instead of them dealing, I'm glad your friend tried to patiently explain to them why, right? Because many of them just couldn't hear it. They didn't get it.
I remember
they were living in this kind of bubble that
it was on the beach in a bar, and they were literally like a couple feet in front of a big old TV, like a 70-inch screen TV. And I just remember them. Yeah, it's not going to come across over radio, but like their jaw, like down, looking at the TV. This random person, and my friend tries to go and talk to them just because he's that kind of social guy. But yeah, it was like that. The people were in that for months after. It wasn't just that night. Shocked. Months after, people were like, "What?
Yeah, like, what does it mean?" People were freaked out. I don't know. That night, I had this glee, even though weirded out.
I'm making fun of him, but I kind of can't even blame him because it is a big shock.
Yeah, it is. I had this kind of look. I backed Sanders, right? And I thought the way they treated Sanders was appalling. Thought completely abominable, all the way down to them not letting Nina Turner speak for Sanders because Nina Turner backed Sanders, and it was like, look, she's not going to be able to say, like all of the stuff. It's like they hoist Sanders up, was throwing eggs and whatnot, kind of like Romans conquering, a dictator or not a dictator, one of the fallen tribesmen or something. The king is in his underwear, and they're like throwing eggs.
Shaming him.
Yeah, basically shaming him as he goes through. That's what they did to Sanders. At least that's what the Democratic Convention was. He was like crying and whatnot. And so when all of these people lost, And you had all of these Democrats crying with their Hillary signs. I thought it was funny.
I was actually at the Democratic National Convention back in 2016. I was. And you know what? You know how today's National Llama Day?
Yeah.
My key memory of the Democratic National Convention is it's going crazy. People are like, wait, what's going on here? What's going on with Bernie and Hillary? At least that's how I remember it. People protesting like crazy. Yeah, big marches. That's the thing. I remember it. And then all of a sudden down the street while there are these protests going on, somebody walks by with a llama on a tether. They're just walking by. No explanation ever given. I see him around a couple of times that night. And that's what I remember about that night.
Random.
It is,
Man,
it is
so random. Let's take a break. Yeah. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Back in a moment with the one and only Ted Raw. We have several really interesting stories, including Biden working behind the scenes to get the press to give him better coverage. Fascinating. Fault Lines, Thomas and Stranahan. Back shortly.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys find yourself in the D.C. area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So there's a great article that came out. This was Oliver Dorsey, and he makes the point that says some news and reliable sources, senior White House and administration officials have been holding briefings with major newsrooms over the past week as they try to reshape economic coverage. What do you mean by trying to reshape economic coverage? What you mean is that the coverage that the Biden administration has been getting has not been good, whether it's on infrastructure, whether it's not the infrastructure thing, but whether it's on the negotiations around Biden's agenda or lack of Biden being able to get that agenda passed, whether it's on the cutting the amount of money that was supposed to be added to that, meaning the $3.5 trillion being cut to $1 trillion and then not even passing at this particular point, whether it's the Afghanistan pullout, whether it's the COVID cases that seem to be spiking and rising. One issue after the next has just not gone well, not to mention the issue of inflation. So Biden hasn't been getting good coverage on that stuff. He doesn't necessarily like it. The White House is unsatisfied with the coverage they've been getting, and so they're reaching out to media with briefings. You need to treat us better at this White House. To have a conversation about this and other stories that are basically percolating, we're joined with Ted Rawl. Ted Rawl is a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. Ted, thank you for joining us, man. How you doing this morning?
I'm good, but I guess my invitation to the New York Times newsroom got lost because I want to lobby for better coverage for me.
I know, right? I mean,
saying nice things about me.
Nobody contacted us to, for our, to give us briefings on that. I would love to be part of that briefing. Would you love to be a part of that briefing?
Of course I would.
That's right.
They haven't given me any coverage. I just want them to get. No, I'm just kidding.
It's like I just want the coverage in general, right? What do you think about that? I mean, I find it to be amazing. I don't put it past them because politicians in general, like I said before, they have their media contacts that they work with behind the scenes and everything else. I mean, if we have a situation where Don Lemon is reaching out to Jussie Smollett, then clearly politicians are going to definitely want that good coverage, and they're definitely going to want them to be framed a particular way. Public management is their job on some level. But it feels a little weird and forced that the media, that I got to be honest, has treated Biden with kid gloves in comparison to the way they treated Trump. And yet, they're still saying we need more favorable coverage.
And they're saying that the Biden administration has been treated worse than Trump.
Yeah, that was one of the arguments. I mean, they were making this argument basically saying that initially, and they even show this kind of stat that they're showing, and they show Biden getting great coverage in the beginning and then tanking. When you look at Trump's coverage, his always was in the red. So this notion that it's like, and then they make this argument of, you guys are giving a neutral commentary to people who are trying to destroy democracy, while the protector of democracy is getting horrible coverage. The protector of democracy, in this case, being supposedly Joe Biden. What are your thoughts on that, Ted? It just seems so over the top in regards to the administration. If they want good coverage, do better things.
It is over the top. I mean, the Dana Milbank and the Washington Post argument just obviously is laughable. I mean, you can count up data points and, positive and negative data coverage, but of coverage and add it up that way. But that doesn't talk about the scale of the negativity or the positivity, right? I mean, the tone, the shrieking tenor of coverage against Donald Trump, that he presented an existential threat to everything that is good and decent in America and in the world. That just isn't, you can count that exactly the same as, Biden could be doing a little bit better on the supply chain, but it's not the same in terms of its weight, right? I mean, it's like sort of like an F- and a C- are both not great grades, but you don't weigh them the same. And it's just, it is absurd. I look at this from the standpoint of a journalist, and I think it's, I know it's a common practice, but I do think it's unethical for there to be these very close ties between government and media. I don't think, even if the president himself says, I want to come in and meet with the editorial board of the New York Times, that they should accept the invitation.
Yeah.
If Biden has something to say, he should go and give a press conference or deliver a speech
or an interview.
New York Times can cover it. Leave it at that.
Agreed. Not to mention, and I'm passing it over to Shane, Trump and Russia took place 3-4 years where they basically tried to lead or get rid of a sitting president over conspiracy theory. This notion that Biden somehow is getting more negative coverage than that he's working with a foreign adversary in order to undermine America. Come on. Like, it doesn't even pass the smell test. Shane, please.
I'm trying to figure out what was going on through their heads. Like, did they take themselves seriously when they make that claim? Because this was,
I suspect Miliband does, yeah.
This wasn't for public consumption, right? If we're taking, I don't know in what world this is. The Biden administration intended this communication to be leaked.
Right.
This is, Oliver Dorsey, the guy, who did this work.
Because you lose your impact if if people know about it.
My point is, this was for their ears. This was between the editorial staff and the team that went down to talk to the editorial staff.
Yeah.
So then, what was going through their head? What were they expecting their words? How were they expecting their words to be heard by the team they were going to speak to? I'm guessing the case they were making, we're having to read some between the lines here because of course we don't have a transcript, is like Trump, this sexist bigot. We didn't manage to get him out of office, and you guys covered him constantly. You gave him constant media coverage leading up to his election, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Because I don't know in what other universe, like how deep would their heads have to be in the sand for them to be able to convince themselves that Biden is not getting better treatment?
I mean, they're Democrats. I think
you see my question.
I totally see your point. Dana Miliband made the point. He did an op-ed. Media treats Biden as badly or worse than Trump. And he makes some statement to the effect of like, they're basically being, they're not, meaning one side is trying to destroy democracy, the other side is not, and the media is being neutral to both sides, which, implicitly, the media needs to be more agreeable with one of those sides in order to help that side fight for democracy. That's basically the argument. They need to be more biased in the way to cover Biden. It's very weird commentary.
Ted, Jamarl passed it over to me, and I didn't want to respond directly to one of the things you said, which I feel should be reiterated or double downed on or outlined or something like that. So I'll do it now, which is, no, there should not be this relationship between the presidency and the editorial staff of any outlet at all. The president shouldn't think to do that, and the editorial staff should not welcome it. should not permit it, because that's, of course, coloring their credibility as it is the presidency's. And for both parties, if news of this gets out, as it has in this case, the question asked by the public is, okay, but what other stuff do you talk about? And what exactly were you saying in that meeting? And have you come to any sort of agreement? Or are there things you're not telling me about this relationship that you have with each other? And, what other relationships do you have with other media outlets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Those are all the questions that get asked in a credible space. And, it's a couple hundred years ago that I would have thought we'd developed from the yellow journalism of the 19th century or the party periodicals and party papers of the 18th century, where you had these, arguably, I don't know the distance between the presidency or the, high members of the American government at that time and the party papers they ran. But it doesn't seem like we've come that far, Ted. You have more historical context than I do. What do you think we've become over the last couple hundred years? How does this compare to the history, Ted?
Yeah, I think it's become cozier, right? I mean, there's a reason that, like, for example, the Arkansas Democrat is called that, right? There's all these legacies of papers that, like, as you say, were completely owned and by partisans. But it wasn't routine for the editorial board of, say, the Chicago Tribune to receive a visit, from the mayor, to receive a personal visit by presidential candidates. But that's really routine, at any major newspaper now, and I assume also at broadcast outlets like CNN. Yeah. It's really routine for these guys to drop in and have little coffee clatches, and it's usually off the record. It's usually not recorded. It's usually not reported at all, or even in full. It's usually, lobbying for an endorsement, and just, it's cronyism. It's the old boys network. And that didn't happen, I think, as much in the past because, it wasn't really possible for, say, Andrew Jackson to, drop by Little Rock and say hi, right? I mean, it was, whereas now, it's really easy, whether they do it by Zoom or whether they do it in person. Yeah. It's really routine. If you sit in the newsroom of any major newspaper, you're going to see one of these meetings almost every single day with some kind of notable politician. And it's kind of gross. And, it's so routine they don't even think it's wrong.
What's wild about that, too, it all depends on secrecy, which makes it worse on some level. Meaning, if you know that this president has been trying to get all of these guys to give him good coverage, and then they get good coverage, well, you were pushed to give them good coverage. But what if you didn't know that the communications was taking place behind the scenes, and all of a sudden these people just started giving good coverage? You could get the public into a mindset that something had fundamentally changed in the way the administration was kind of operating, as opposed to just the administration leaning on his supporters in the press for better coverage. It's this, it's deceitful on some level to even try it. And I agree with you. I'm not shocked that Biden would do it. It's unfortunate that the media would allow it, if that makes sense. So, no, I totally agree with you on this one, Ted. Let's do this. Let's move for a little bit. There's a few other stories, but I want to get to Juice, in quotes, Smollett, in the trial. He basically took the stand yesterday and got eviscerated by the prosecutor on the stand for obvious reasons. And I know a lot of people say, well, he shouldn't go to jail for this. And I think people need a cathartic, okay, yes, I'm lying. Because I feel like you're insulting my intelligence by keep pushing this particular story. I mean, you said that the people were pale. These guys were black as midnight. You say that they were Trump supporters in the middle of Chicago. And then then the basic question that the prosecutor asked, how did they even know where you were? I mean, Chicago, it was in the middle of a blizzard at like 2 a.m. His story falls apart. He even goes so far as to say, well, they told me, we were on the phone, and he told me to go get eggs because, I'm paying them for a workout. And so I went to get the food at 2 a.m. in the middle of a blizzard, and they found me because of that. And it's like, what? And so the prosecutor asks, well, why were you guys caught on videotape walking around the block multiple times together on the day before during a trial run? Like, his story makes no sense. And then the question, I think it boils down to, is the judge going to give him jail time for basically lying on the stand? Because it's one thing to give a story and they find you guilty. It's another thing if the judge believes, okay, you just got up here and flagrantly lied. You lied in my court. You lied on the stand to the jury and everything else. And will there be punitive charges for that, meaning that goes beyond the 6. So what might not have started off as jail time, what might have started off as community service, ends up with him spending a month in the clink. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, I just find the story to be so ludicrous. It's phenomenally ridiculous, and it's exactly what you would think an actor would come up with when they're pushing the story out. What are your thoughts, Ted?
Man, I'm all over the place about this story. You know, and I kind of don't like anyone involved. I mean, I like you. I don't believe Smollett's story. It doesn't ring true. I wonder, you know, about his defense attorney. You know, why he didn't try to cut a deal. Why did he decide to fight this and go to trial?
But I think that's a Smollett thing. I think that's a Juicy thing. Because I was thinking it myself. It's like, why are you pushing this so hard? But I think what it boils down to is his career is done. And if you are Juicy Smollett and you know that all of these people know that you did this kind of big-time hoax just for your own self-aggrandizement on that particular show, on Empire, okay, what about other shows? Are those shows going to hire you? And is there any incentive for you to basically say, okay, I was lying? Or do you just roll the dice with the hope that if they find me not guilty on some kind of weird anomaly?
Well, I could get into that too for a second.
Yeah, go for it.
Which is, and producer Blackjack sent this one over. The idea of jury nullification, the idea that Juicy has so well made his case in the jury, to the jury, and that, you know, the media in general, I know that they screen for this stuff, but that there's this atmosphere set up by the defense and by Juicy himself, where the jury might decide to do not guilty even though they think he actually is guilty because it's a sort of taking a stand for something, and because Juicy has managed to portray himself very effectively as like the black gay man who's, this is the thing. Yeah. He managed to portray himself effectively as that. Where you go from there, whether or not you think that he's being, you know, persecuted or whatever, that gets iffy. But anyway, jury nullification, the idea that they would do not guilty even though they believe guilty. That he is guilty, just to make a point. That's the weird thing. You know, we'll see if that happens. It's a possibility, though. Ted, what's your take?
I mean, I think also one side of this, and I don't know if I'm alone in this. Maybe I don't know how you guys feel about it. I also wonder what is gained for the taxpayers of the city of Chicago by even having this trial. I mean, you know, in a sense, every single trial in the world has at least one liar in it, right? Because one side's telling the truth and so one side's not telling the truth. So someone's always committing perjury in every civil and criminal court proceeding ever that's ever going to be. And I mean, this is a little extreme, and you could see why the Chicago PD was pissed off at having their time wasted and all that. But part of me also thinks, you know, they're kind of punishing him because he's a black dude. You know, it's like, you know, it's like a, you know, when it's like a white guy who like lies about some, you know, being attacked or whatever, you know, it just seems like this might have just not been charged. It might have just been like, hey, you know, don't call the PD again next time. Leave us alone. You know, we're going to be a little slower at responding to your 911 call. It's like, I don't really see, you know, but he's not a danger to society.
It's not about him being a danger to society. I got to be honest. I would have pressed charges on him. And, I mean, he is basically using race and homophobia, or let's say sexuality, for his own benefit. And in doing so, he's basically undermining those communities. I mean, there are hate crimes that actually take place. There is homophobia that's out there, or racism that's out there. And he's basically using that for his own, you know, extra cash and for his own, you know, additional leverage in that show. It's not so much that he's going to go out there and injure somebody or harm somebody, but I think it's more along this notion that you raise this issue to prominence in front of everybody. Now, if you were one of those Trump Republicans, you're looking at that, very upset and angry, and you want something done about it. So there's that part. But also, if you're one of those people who suffered some kind of homophobic attack or suffered some kind of racist attack, and you see him basically using that as a way to make himself that much more rich, I got to be honest, it bothers you. I get the cops. Cops are just angry at him because he decided to do this, and he put them on notice, and it, you know, kind of got embarrassed and everything else with the attention that was given to it. But from the standpoint of the communities that he claimed to be representing, he's basically undermining those communities while claiming to represent those communities. I don't know. I took issue with this. I feel you in this kind of logical way of, okay, is it really worth this much to prosecute this case? by the same token, he's not giving it up. Like, it's one thing if he said, okay, I did it, I'm lying. But he's at no point owned up to the fact that he's lying about this. I don't know. What are your thoughts? I mean, yeah, what are your thoughts? Because I disagree on that particular point. I want you to get your response in.
Yeah, no, I mean, I hear you. I mean, it's definitely, you know, it's kind of like, you know, like the Barnard College mattress girl case, you know, where a woman filed a false allegation of rape against a fellow student.
Yes.
And, you know, and it makes real rape victims, it discredits them, it gives them a steeper hill to climb when they're trying to get justice and accountability. So I get it. But it just seems to me like this was prosecutorial overkill. You know, it's like, don't you guys have you know, can't you use that courtroom for something better in a city like Chicago where, you know, you had a professional Chicago PD torture operation going on for years? Don't you have someone else you could, you know, don't you have some other trial you should be holding instead? That's just, I just think of it as a weird allocation of resources.
I hear you. I'm happy to see it happening personally, even though it probably technically is wasteful in that sense, just because it's bringing to light all the other weird stuff that was going on with the other people acting on his behalf. And of course, the text from Don Lemon and the call that Kim Fox, the DA in this case, got apparently from Michelle Obama's staff, where after she got that call, she decided to stand down on prosecuting the case to not actually prosecute, which, you know, of course, has been reversed since then, notably. But, you know, it's those connections. It's that stuff that came out and that I'm getting a chance to see now that this case is actually going to trial. Technically, people were talking. I didn't know about the Kim Fox, Michelle Obama thing until just the other day when we had a guest on who was bringing that up, and it turns out that actually was the thing that happened. Anyway, it's the other weird stuff where, yes, Jussie Smollett lied, but then you had all these other people coming out to support him in a way that seems irresponsible politically to me, given the available facts of the case. And then it's like that message got out. The message that this guy was attacked, that this happened, it was used for political purposes against Trump at a time leading into an election season, right? And now we're getting to see him have his day in court. And we're getting to see that, you know, narrative reversed. In other words, I'm happy to see that narrative getting reversed and seriously questioned. And I think that's what a lot of people are happy to see this case going to trial are happy to see about it, right? Ted, what's your take on that? Technically, it might be a waste of the resources of the department, of the city, but isn't it good to have this chance to reconsider what actually happened and what this means for our politics in terms of everybody who decided to get involved? Ted, what's your take?
I agree. I mean, look, the accountability is always fair, but part of me chafes at the fact that, to me, Smollett, you know, is a celebrity, but he's kind of a small fish. I mean, you know, we were talking just earlier about, you know, you guys talking about Russiagate. I mean, you know, is Hillary Clinton ever going to be held accountable for her role in, you know, ginning up the Steele dossier? I mean, big fish like her always get away with much bigger lies.
Yeah.
You know, in the greater scheme of things, Smollett is no one. And it's like, it is something that bugs me about seeing someone, you know, who committed such a idiotic, trivial political stunt, you know, getting the book slammed, you know, like dropped on them, and then, you know, possibly going to prison, while much bigger crimes go completely, you know, unaddressed, unprosecuted, unaccounted for, unreported.
That seems fair.
That's fair.
I can agree with you on that one ultimately, because what pisses me off about this case, it is how Smollett acted, but it's also this sense that it's part of this, I don't know, wider degradation of our culture, where he can make that claim. It can screw up the perceptions Americans have of each other. Because what
support?
He gets a bunch of support. All these people coming out.
President's wife.
Yeah, and then it's like, then people find out that he was lying about it. I don't know. You see what I'm saying? Is that it feels damaging to our culture in a way that's hard to measure and therefore calibrate a response to. But it's like there needs to be some turning on that. But I also completely hear your point, which is Smollett's just some dude who's just trying to get a leg up, and all these other people who are pitching into it, who I'm ultimately kind of more pissed about, they're not going to have to pay any consequences or have to face a trial on the lies they tell. I hear you on that completely, Ted. We've got to close pretty soon here. Any last thoughts, any last comments here?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I just think it's, you know, in general, if I'm a prosecutor, I'm thinking about I should be more focused on bigger targets. And this just seems, look, what Smollett did was obviously wrong. It also, part of me thinks that it might be more than just trying to get a leg up, or self-aggrandizement. I wonder if there's, some, mental illness issue there, it's really messed up and strange. It's one thing, it's the kind of idea that you might come up with your buds over beers, but then, the next morning you wake up and you're like, boy, that was sure stupid. And, the coffee kicks in and you don't do it. But to plan it all out and pay these guys, these two dopes, $3,000 in a world where there are millions of security cameras everywhere, what was he thinking?
I think he thought everybody else was stupid. I think he thought that because of the context of Trump and all of this talk about white nationalists and everything else, that the public would basically give him the benefit of the doubt, that he was an actor. And because he was such an esteemed actor, that he could basically pull it off. I don't think he was mentally ill. I think he was just greedy. I think there's a difference between those two things. But I feel you. I do agree with your point about the big fish and how this guy is basically a small fish trying to get this kind of petty con. One thing I want to move to, Democrats and, let's say, woke liberals like to use Latinx. Now, this is basically the woke trying to force and tell people how they should talk about other people, even the communities themselves. I was fascinated by this story. So they just recently had this polling that basically came out, and it made the point that only 2% of those polls were polled, meaning Hispanics, use the term Latinx. So out of the entire community, only 2% are like, yeah, we use that term Latinx. 6 to 8% call themselves Hispanic. 21% favors Latino or Latina. And one thing that I want to put into that is the O or the A, Shane made this point, gives you a gender reference, meaning the language itself has the gender of the person built into the language itself.
Well, but then also there's this other slightly lesser known variant that some people have started to use that's like endemic from the language, which is there's Latina, Latino, of course, the first is feminine, the latter is masculine. Then there's Latine, which is a gender neutral version that's technically completely appropriate, fits within the language that already exists within the language.
Right.
It didn't get this like wave of popularity that Latinx did. And so Latinx, I was saying earlier, I think off air, I see it as this is my like woke way of putting it or something. I see it as a colonization of the Spanish language.
Yeah,
these are like largely American as far as I can tell, but specifically Western impositions. Anyway, that's my take.
Because it's not Hispanics that are doing it. It's only like 2% that own it. What's more interesting in this part, this is more problematic for Democrats. 40% say Latinx bothers or offends them to some degree, and 30% say they would less likely support a politician who basically uses it. Now, when we're looking at Biden's unpopularity, the Democratic Party's unpopularity, one of the things that we're seeing is a losing support among blacks, but also among Hispanics, meaning that this particular group, meaning Democrats, have decided, like Shane said, colonization of the language, and is basically calling them something that they don't like, that they don't use themselves, and that in no particular way do they even support in using, and frowns upon, even to the point of not supporting the people who are basically using that terminology. And this is basically widely just among Democrats.
It's kind of awesome. One of my strong beliefs is that people should be called whatever the hell they want to be called.
Yeah.
Now, I never understood why the media would refuse to call Myanmar, and they always like, no, it's Burma. It hasn't been called Burma in many, many, many years. It's Myanmar. And anyway, so call people what they want to be called. It's obvious, when I first tripped over the term Latinx, my biggest objection to it, I'm an Anglo, I have no Hispanic ancestry at all, as far as I know. But the way it reads, it reads like Latinx.
Yes.
You're just when it's written, and every time you come across it, it doesn't make sense. I mean, it almost seems to me like the X should be capped. Latin X, like Malcolm X. But anyway, it just doesn't. It's really linguistically hard, but hey, I'm just going to roll with whatever Hispanics or Latinos want to be called, and we'll just keep up.
Well, that's a reasonable take, but here's the thing. When I first heard about this was from a friend of mine who's grew up mostly Spanish family, but hadn't learned the language, or at least much of it, and was going through early 20s learning the language. And he, learning the language, has, sort of leaned left himself, had gotten used to using Latinx, and then met people who basically were native speakers and told him that they were kind of irritated by this weird imposition coming from the outside. And again, that it's like they technically already had a way of handling this, but there was this sense that their culture was trying to be changed. And so then he relayed that to me, which is like, I hear you on the idea of I'll just go along with whatever they want, but at the same time, it feels like they're being told to go along with whatever this outsider group wants too. And that's a specifically Western thing, which is why, I wouldn't go as far as the French under Macron, this government calling, I don't know, maybe it is. The whole woke thing, like cultural imperialism or something like, I forget the colonization or something. There are different ways of looking at it, but basically this sort of imperialistic academic outgrowth that comes to define the cultures overseas, that feels like an imposition, and it feels like a Western one, and I can't help but think that it benefits geopolitically, the American state, American intel agencies in various ways, and also just the prestige of America as a nation, which, for better or for worse, whatever. I don't know. That's another tangent. We've got to go out. Ted, thank you for joining us. Thank you for sticking with this conversation. Any last thoughts before we close here?
I'm just looking out for Joe Biden's new poll numbers.
Oh, yeah. Keep getting lower. Keep dropping. Ted Rall joining us this morning. Always good. Ted is a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist who you should follow on Twitter at Ted Rall. Also read his cartoons and articles at Rall.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break. We'll be back in a minute taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Be back in just a minute.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now, the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show by any means necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We have some calls. We're going to be taking calls. The number is 202-521-1320. We have two callers on the line. But before I go to the callers, I want to bring up the story that just kind of came out. President Joe Biden will lean on a Ukrainian counterpart to make progress on autonomy for Kiev's breakaway regions and indicate that NATO membership is off the table for at least a decade. This is coming from the AP. The agency claims Biden plans to call President Zelensky on Thursday, 2 days after his 2-hour-long negotiations with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The American leader is expected to put pressure on Kiev so that it makes progress on delivering on its obligations under the Minsk agreement signed back in 2015. And the conversation Shane and I were having was basically whatever the provocative strongman perspective that Biden probably gave media after the communications, the reality of it is they probably had a different conversation than what was explicitly told to us, the public, and the media. Because to come away from that conversation and then to immediately say, okay, I'm going to put pressure on the Ukraine in order to get Ukraine to do X or Y, that doesn't come across as if I demanded Putin do this.
Sounds a bit conciliatory.
It does.
And yet he's portrayed himself as provocative. Yep. And I made the point, this is a lie. They're lying to us. He's lying to us, and his administration is lying to us about exactly how he communicated with a leader of a foreign country at a key time of conflict. In other words, he's lying. I don't know. It's just a big thing. And I get leaders lie, and they will portray themselves in different ways. And anybody's going to play themselves up to the extent that they do that kind of thing. But this seems like a direct reversal. It seems like it's cutting in the exact opposite direction of how he portrayed himself. And to shame Biden, he should be out of office. Let's go, Brandon. I don't know what else to say. It's that kind of thing. Seriously, he lied on that. He's lying on that level. That's not the kind of thing you should do at a moment where we're, it seems like, barreling towards a war with the other major power with a lot of nukes.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have callers. Let's go to Tarif from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on. What's going on?
I have 4 quick comments. It's going to be quick. Free drilling signs, free Dungeons, and hashtag no more. First comment is dealing with the African leaders is trying to get some seats on the Security Council, permanent seats. I think 2 of them, one for Ethiopia and one for Nigeria, because they're the most populous countries. And also, you have this politician from New Jersey, Representative Smith, is pushing for like sanctions against Nigeria. That's not going to end well for him and other people that push sanctions for Nigeria, because you have a lot of Nigerians here, and that's a voting bloc. So I don't think that's going to end well for him and anybody else. Ilhan Omar might get voted out next year for what she done with Ethiopia. My next comment is done with they have China made a deal with with Guinea, Equatorium, the Guinea. I can't pronounce the name. In Africa,
Equatorial Guinea.
Equatorial Guinea, to build a Navy base there that's going to give access to the Atlantic Ocean. So that's China's going to have a base there. And my last comment is I need to apologize to Jamarl and everybody else that believe in UFOs and aliens, because I believe in them. But what I was trying to say 2 days ago, I was thinking about, but I didn't make it clear enough that you have these groups of people that worship aliens as if they're gods and stuff like that, and as if they, God sent, but they're just regular beings like us, right? So when I was saying crazy UFO, I meant to say those are cult groups.
I see.
Or not. You see what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah. Those crazy UFO believers. Yeah, I remember making a joke on that. But no, you're good, Tarif.
Yeah, you're fine.
Thank you for the call. Thank you for the heads up. I hadn't heard about China's the plans to build that base in Equatorial Guinea. Tarif, of course, constantly bringing good and relevant news up when he calls in. Thank you for that, Tarif. We have other callers. Want to go to them? Let's go to Nate calling in from Atlanta. Nate, you're on. What's going on?
Hey, how you doing? I'm just calling about the day that Trump got elected. It kind of reminds me of the Chris Rock SNL skit. But it was with me and my best friend and our girlfriends, and we being the only brothers around, saying that we kind of predicted Trump was going to get elected, and was like, okay, whatever. But our girlfriends, they basically had a panic attack.
Oh yeah, they didn't respond well.
Yeah,
that's funny. I mean, it was jarring on some level. I remember. Let me see, Shane. You were with your brother, and you guys were out in California.
I was with Chris and Pat, just a couple friends.
You did say that. I think my wife had went to bed, which I was like, "How are you going to bed? This is the middle of an election. This is pretty exciting." And I'm sitting there all night, up to maybe 3 a.m, watching state after state all.
Yeah.
And it's like, and because the media was getting desperate, they were like, okay, there's a 49% chance for Donald Trump to take it. It's like
all of a sudden the enemy's at the gates.
Yeah, it's like the enemy is at the gate. TYT melted down like nobody's business. I think like Anna came back, started screaming on camera and stuff like that. Phenomenal night.
Yeah.
Phenomenal night. But so yeah, man, it's like I think everybody knows where they were on the night Donald Trump got elected.
Nate from Atlanta, thank you for the call, man. Funny anecdote. Good revisiting those kinds of moments. We've got to close this hour out. I want to thank everybody who called in this hour. I want to thank Ted for joining us, of course. Well, why am I? It's as if I'm closing the show out. I'm not closing the show out. We'll be back in just a minute with our last show this morning. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back with headlines on the other side of this short break.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for the last hour of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner over here, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am your indefatigable, ever-vigilant, last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And that means that with us together, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Good morning, everybody. Once again, it is just past 9 a.m. Eastern. It is December 9th, 2021, and that means it's time for our third and last batch of headlines this morning. First up with COVID news. Yesterday in the United States, there were 149,041 new COVID cases reported. There were also 1,851 new deaths reported. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 121,000 cases per day. That's an increase of 27% from the average 2 weeks ago. 60% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated. 71% of residents have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine. And for the total stats, as of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 49,505,300 people across the United States. It has killed 791,933 people here. In national news, President Joe Biden is set to participate in a virtual Summit for Democracy from the White House beginning today, where he'll host more than 100 participants representing governments, civil society, and private sector leaders. That summit has been billed as an opportunity to collaborate on fighting corruption and promoting respect for human rights. However, the gathering already has drawn backlash from the United States' chief adversaries and other nations that weren't invited to participate. The ambassadors to the U.S. from China and Russia wrote a joint essay in the National Interest Policy Journal. There they described the Biden administration as exhibiting a Cold War mentality that will, quote, stoke up ideological confrontation and a rift in the world, end quote. The governors of Maine and New York deployed the National Guard in response to dangerously low capacity at statewide medical facilities due to the pandemic. The New York National Guard announced Wednesday that it had deployed 120 medics and medical technicians to a dozen long-term care facilities statewide. The deployment came at the behest of Governor Kathy Hochul, who issued the order last week in response to staffing shortages. Former Trump White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows is suing the House Select Committee investigating January 6 and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, asking a federal court to block enforcement of the subpoena the committee issued him, as well as the subpoena it issued to Verizon for his phone records. The lawsuit comes after the committee signaled it would pursue a criminal contempt referral against Meadows because of his refusal to sit for a deposition in the investigation into the Capitol riot. Meadows alleges that the subpoenas are, quote, overly broad and unduly burdensome, end quote, while claiming that the committee, quote, lacks lawful authority to seek and to obtain, end quote, the information requested. The Senate will begin considering a bill on Thursday that would create a fast-track, well, it's today, that would create a fast-track process allowing Democrats to raise the federal debt limit without votes from Republicans. That's a crucial next step as lawmakers race the clock to avert a catastrophic debt default. A first-ever default would trigger financial disaster. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has warned the debt limit could be reached on December 15th. That's less than a week away, leaving little time to act. Party leaders on both sides of the aisle have made clear that default must be prevented, but Republicans have insisted that Democrats should bear the burden of raising the limit on their own. In international news, Evergrande, the embattled Chinese property developer, has defaulted on its debt. That's according to Fitch Ratings. The credit ratings agency on Thursday downgraded the company and its subsidiaries to restricted default, meaning that the firm has failed to meet its financial obligations. In sports news, the Arizona Coyotes of the National Hockey League could potentially be without access to their home arena later this month if delinquent taxes and back rent aren't paid. That's according to a letter sent to team ownership from Glendale City manager Kevin Phelps. And in holiday news, for this last hour, we've got Techno Day. Today is Techno Day and Wary Willy Day. What?
What does that mean?
You have to give me a second to recover.
Wary Willy?
With that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Wary Willy Day is a recognition of the art of clowning, but with a twist. Wary Willy, as the name suggests, is a clown who wears his smile upside down Apparently, this was a character popularized by a circus performer in the 1930s, Wary Willie.
Wary. Oh, that's why they're using Wary.
Completely forgotten about. Yeah, it's only like 80 years ago, but I've never heard of this dude, I swear.
I've never heard of him either. Wary Willie. And they gave him a day.
Gave him a day.
Fair enough. Fair enough. He became iconic in and of himself, I suppose.
Just wait for our culture to turn on clowns, and we'll.
Clowns are creepy, man.
I know. We already have it. We should stop celebrating clowns, is my point. There should be, the tearing down of the statues. There should be a tearing down of the clown holidays.
What was that guy who was walking through the city or through various towns as a clown? And it would just like be pitch black, and he'd just be walking around, and he would like get close to people. I don't know. Do you
was like an
remember this?
urban legend.
No, but it was happening for real. The guy was doing this for real. This was one of those phenomena that was taking place. It was a few years ago, and people would be. They have all these YouTube videos and everything else, and they were having all these reports. But people were just walking around like in a clown outfit, being creepy to the hilt, pitch black outside, and they're just kind of moseying around and getting close, freaking people out. Clowns.
Is this like the Mandela effect or whatever it's called? You know what I mean? Where people misremember things? Because I don't remember that happening.
You don't remember that?
I didn't live in that reality.
I swear, Google that. That was taking place. This was a few years ago.
Usually people think that with the whole parallel universe thing that you're splitting off
like
as
a
time
bleed
goes
over
forward
or
something like that. But maybe it's reversed. Maybe we came from separate universes and now we're converging into the same one. Because I have no memory of that past tomorrow.
Oh, you got to look that up. I swear you got to look that up. That's fascinating.
That's trippy. No, I tried to look it up, and then I just see random people complaining about clowns stalking them, and I'm like, I can't tell if there's a trend here or if it's just something that happens. Well, all the more reason to ban clown holidays, though.
Oh, funny. We were talking about this earlier. The Atlas V rocket launches, the NASA laser communication prototype and Space Force experiments in the orbit. Now, I got to be honest. When I read this initially, I thought, that's not bad. I mean, I guess my issue is it becomes a militaristic thing as opposed to, okay, we just want to improve communications in space. Meaning it's not done for the sake of doing it for us to get further out into space and everything else. This stuff is probably going to have some level of militaristic application. But Atlas V rocket lit up the pre-dawn over Florida. The two-stage rocket blasted off from Space Launch Complex 41 at Cape Canaveral, 5:19 a.m. as part of a mission called STP, basically Space Test Program 3. Let's see. The point of this is to... where is it? Basically, they're putting satellites in orbit, and they're going to be doing some kind of experimentation. And the experimentation and the satellites they're putting in have to do with laser communications. I guess the thought being that using lasers in this kind of high-powered thing, you can communicate in these locations faster than you would under normal circumstances, I guess. And maybe trying to improve the level of communication. And this is after, I believe it was NASA has basically said they're trying to put some kind of nuclear reactor like on the moon or something, to, again, improve energy production going into the next decade or so. Some of the stuff is fascinating to me. It's a department dedicated to overseeing the Department of Defense space-related activities. Most of the payloads on board are classified, but they are resting on a new platform designed for long-duration flight known as LPDE. And let me see, the vehicle is designed to host payloads for up to 3 years. Right here. Called Laser Communication Relay Deployment or Demonstration, the experimental satellite will help NASA transmit data across space as agencies plan to return to the moon in the next few years. Currently, the agency relies on communication methods that rely on radio frequencies, but lasers are significantly more efficient, the officials have said. So we're getting these kind of new experiments. I'm a sucker for the experimentation like this, like in space and these kind of big projects and everything else. The fact that it's classified makes me frown upon that on some level because it has this kind of militaristic application to it as opposed to just being research and expansion for the sake of research and expansion. But, an argument can be made that the military tends to get that stuff first and it, flows down to other organizations and groups and private enterprise as it's going out. So we'll see. But I do like it.
They keep on doing those confidential experiments, and then like a couple of years from now, like the sun goes out because they wrap it in a Dyson sphere, and we had no idea it was coming.
Right.
No, I don't like those confidential experiments either. You know what's a trip, though, is if you go through the DARPA completed, I forget what the exact search is, but there's a way that you can search on the DARPA website, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is, the big, but the big, I would say like more public-facing, defense research agency.
Yeah.
where they're doing a bunch of those kinds of like hardware research, looking at new technologies, those kinds of things. Anyway, you can go through and search through their like completed projects, and they have public facing. I'm sure some of it's redacted, quite a bit of it probably, but they have a bunch of like public facing reviews of projects they've gone through recently.
Yeah.
So for a certain kind of person, you can go through and it's pretty trippy. Now that's in public, but of course the assumption is they're keeping a lot of stuff back, right? They're probably
they got some black stuff in the
got some black book projects too. Yeah, I want it to be public, both because I want to have a government that I can legitimately trust and who trusts me enough to be like, okay, sure, just take a look at what we're doing and we don't care. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That sounds healthy. But also, of course, just because it's cool.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, it's just cool. You want to learn about it. What do they do? Wait, what are they doing? How does that work exactly?
And I also feel like if they're hiding it, there's probably some kind of militaristic application behind it. Meaning, are you really hiding it if it's just an issue of, okay, this is just communications or this is just the test, whatever. I think you hide it when this is some kind of detection mechanism. This is some kind of mechanism for some kind of weapon in space, or we're testing things that if we tell people, especially other people who are experts in this particular field, they'll be able to glean what we're actually doing as opposed to what we say we're doing. No, man, I chafe with this kind of secrecy associated with this stuff. Yeah, I just wish it was more than open. I get the feeling things like Elon Musk and some of these other guys who are building these space technologies, at some point, whatever they're doing in regards to this research, those organizations are going to be able to benefit from. It's kind of like NASA. Like all of these like small items that were created just for the rocket ship to work and everything else, eventually that technology gets kind of passed on to other groups and other private enterprise that are able to use and kind of expand upon it.
It gets handed down and suddenly it gets percolated out and the public has access to it.
I suppose it's going to be something like that.
Probably hope
with this.
I'm just curious though, because I'm just curious what the actual point of this is. You know, doing the laser imaging stuff, I've only heard how you've explained it. I can imagine that if you're trying to send satellites and manned missions and all that and more to the moon, and just a lot of those to the moon, having a satellite to coordinate communications.
Yeah, so it's just better.
Picking and sending up EM transmissions, you know,
yes, far more
through
efficient.
lasers, basically, but, you know, just the transmissions of information and direction, that kind of thing.
And if I'm not mistaken, I thought there was something where they were looking to try to figure out nuclear explosions on the planet's surface, like where they could test like nuclear testing and everything else, basically using the stuff in space. But I don't see it in this particular article. But yeah, man, that stuff is fascinating. I mean, we're getting to be this kind of space civilization.
You just skipped over something big. Testing on nuclear explosions in space.
No, not in space. They were like the devices used to look at on the ground, where they could say, okay, this in this particular area there was a nuclear test that took place, et cetera. Like I thought it was that. I don't see it in this article.
Oh, for monitoring on Earth.
Right, monitoring. Yeah. That's what I thought it was, at least when I was looking at this once before. But again, I don't necessarily see it in this particular article. But still, very cool, very nice. I love these projects when we're putting that stuff into space. I wish we did this thing as a world as opposed to kind of these individual actors that are trying to get some kind of advantage out of it. But this is such as life.
Yeah.
The only thing that I hope is over time, when we, I don't know, become more civilized as a society and as a world, that all of the stuff is kind of like prehistory. And that stuff contributes to whatever history we have kind of as a united planet when we're operating. We just kind of have to go through this fighting period to get to that particular point.
Let's close it out.
Sanity.
Let's close it out if you're down.
Absolutely.
You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into our break, and we'll be coming back, speaking with Mark Sloboda, talking again about the Biden-Putin virtual summit with this news that we were talking about just a little while ago about how, you know, what actually happened there, whether it was a provocation, an escalation, or whether Biden was in some ways trying to be conciliatory, whether, you know, that's true, whether they're just words or more. All that and more we're going to be talking about with Mark Sloboda when we come back. You're listening to Fault Lines, back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys happen to find yourself in the D.C. area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM at 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. You can also catch us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. We were having this conversation about the Biden-Putin virtual summit that took place a couple of days ago. And when the press basically reported what Biden talked about, you got this kind of aggressive speech about Biden telling Putin this and talking about the consequences and everything else. However, when you're looking at this after the fact, this report that just came out, U.S. President Joe Biden will lean on Ukrainian counterpart to make progress on autonomy for Kiev's breakaway regions. Well, that gets a little bit interesting. That doesn't sound like the bravado. It sounds like they had somewhat of a more sane and rational conversation with an underscore of reality, as opposed to the provocativeness or the bravado that was basically given to the public or the press afterwards for their own self-aggrandizement within the context of the country and how they're looked at. The agency claims Biden plans to call President Zelensky on Thursday, 2 days after his 2-hour-long negotiations with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The American leader is expected to pressure Kiev so that it makes progress on delivering on its obligations under the Minsk agreement signed back in 2015. This is supposed to be a roadmap for reconciliation between the Ukrainian governments and the Donetsk and Lugansk Eastern demands. To have a conversation about this, not to mention the meeting in and of itself, I just find that to be very interesting, that after the meeting, we end up in a situation where they are, where there's some kind of breakthrough in regards to the U.S. changing its position, or not changing its position, but changing its focus to continuously blaming Russia to this point, pushing Ukraine, the country who we are going to the mat for in this particular issue. To have a conversation about it, we're joined with Mark Sloboda. He's an international relations and security analyst. Mark, how you doing, man? You doing all right?
Jamarl, Shane, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Fault Lines.
And it's always an honor and a pleasure to have you. You're great at explaining what is taking place and what's going on behind the scenes for these type of conversations. What did you think about the Putin-Biden summit in the first place? And how do you frame what might have actually took place in regards to the conversation they had in that summit, considering that Biden is now trying to pressure the Ukraine to fulfill the obligations under the Minsk agreement?
Yeah, it's quite interesting to read and compare the two different presidential readouts of the conversation that took place between them. And if you do so, you will see that the U.S. version is rather short and consists mostly of threats, economic, diplomatic, and otherwise, that the U.S. made against Russia if it dares intervene. Invade was the term they use. Other countries invade, the U.S. intervenes in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the Russian version was about 3 or 4 times as long and went into much more detail about the substantive arguments and counter arguments that the Russian president made to the U.S. president. And the meat of it was one that Russia was complaining about U.S. non-fulfillment of agreements, about changes in tone and I would guess general diplomatic relations that Biden and Putin had previously agreed to at their earlier physical summit, and also that that Ukraine is not fulfilling the terms of the Minsk Accords. I mean, specifically, the regime in Kiev, backed by the U.S., is not. And in this, I think that Russia is starting to go outside the bounds of the Normandy format, which was set up to deal and guarantor the Minsk Accords, with France, Germany, and Russia as the guarantors of the Minsk protocols between the West-backed regime in Kiev and the Russian-backed republics of East Ukraine, in order to finally try to end this frozen conflict and politically reconcile the country from the events of the West-backed putsch, which overthrew the democratically elected government of Ukraine in 2014. For more than 6 years now, since 2015, the regime in Kiev, which had signed on to the accords, and they were cemented in a UN Security Council resolution, approved by the U.S., of course, because it's on the Security Council, and made into international law, they have refused to implement them. And instead, we see increasing amount of provocation by Kiev against Donetsk, now escalating to drone strikes, combat drones bought from Turkey, as well as seizing territories in the OSCE-monitored demilitarized gray zone in between the two forces, and a really disastrous increased amount of shelling of civilian residential areas of eastern Ukraine by Kiev regime forces. And this is coupled with the U.S. and other Western countries increasing military supplies, including missiles, anti-tank missiles, javelins, but as well as mortars, ammunition, artillery shells, all of these things, which are, of course, not being used to kill Russians. They're being used to kill other Ukrainians who don't agree with what happened in the country in 2014. And this is the really disastrous thing about, the U.S. and European facilitation of this. But, the readout of the call is so starkly different from this boisterous Biden going into the meeting saying, I don't respect anyone else's red lines, basically saying only the U.S. has the right to set red lines, right? Because Obama was quite famous for it when Joe Biden was his vice president. But Russia doesn't have any such rights, and that Biden would pay no attention. He would tell Putin where to shove his red lines. But out of the meeting, we hear now coming from AP, and this is an anonymous source, but, AP is a Western, news organization of, repute, that Joe Biden will lean on his Ukrainian counterpart, meaning the comedian turned quote president, unquote, Volodymyr Zelensky, to make progress on autonomy for Kiev's breakaway regions, meaning the Donbass, eastern Ukraine, and indicate that NATO membership is off the table for at least a decade. Well, Russia, of course, will have some concern that they are trying to palm off Russia with nothing, because NATO membership wasn't on the table for Ukraine, at least not in the near future. And whatever the U.S. may have wanted, other NATO members in Europe, particularly Germany and France, Hungary and others, that indicated that they had no intention of letting Ukraine in NATO. So that may not be much. The Russian government was also complaining about the de facto NATOization of Ukraine. I mean, building NATO infrastructure. UK has plans to build military bases in Ukraine. Of course, they'll call them naval stations or something. Attempting to be, obfuscate the reality of the situation, but the amount of armaments, but also the amount of trainers. There are hundreds and hundreds, probably in the low thousands, of, quote, trainers and advisors from the U.S., Canada, the UK, other NATO countries now in Ukraine. A lot of them right on the front lines in Donbass, which means, right up against the Russian border there. And Russia sees this as a security threat that it simply can't stomach. It is a return to a Cuban Missile Crisis scenario where, the U.S., of course, couldn't allow nuclear weapons or offensive Russian military forces to be placed in Cuba. And this is, great powers take such security threats extremely seriously. So Russia will be concerned that the U.S. is making the nice words again, but will not follow through, because Kiev has been dragging its feet with apparent U.S. support and European support for this non-implementation of Minsk for 6 years. Russia, is not going to back down at this point until there is actual developments. And we have to remember the amount of deals that the West has been deceitful and not followed through with on Ukraine. There was the February 21st agreement, which was supposed to be a power-sharing agreement between the democratically elected president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, and the Western-backed insurrectionists in the capital of Kiev. The next day, that was out the door right after Yanukovych had pulled the police off of the streets, and we saw these far-right neo-Nazi militants that were part of the Maidan, the right sector, immediately seizing control of the Rada, seizing control of the presidential residence in Kiev just after, with the Ukrainian president fleeing the capital just hours before that happened. The West is like, well, Yanukovych gave up the presidency. He fled. Yeah, he was chased out by Maidan, far-right, brown shirts that had just gotten done killing dozens of police on the streets of Kiev. And the rest of the police were stood down because of a power-sharing deal that you made and then completely reneged on. Of course, the Minsk Accords, which have never been filled. There was an earlier iteration of them, and then there was the second version of them. And, the U.S. doesn't have a good track record with pulling out of the ABM Treaty, the INF Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, the JCPOA with Iran. There's absolutely no reason to trust the U.S., much less anonymous sources saying things that the U.S. government themselves aren't saying yet. So I think that the Russian government will probably take everything that is being said by anonymous officials to the media with a grain of salt at this point, and demand, that the U.S. push its new client state in Kiev to live up to the deals that it made and that the U.S. signed up to all those years ago.
Mark, coming back, I want to come back to the specific, and that was a great overview of a lot of aspects of the conflicts and the deal, negotiation with Minsk 1 and Minsk 2. But coming back to the summit itself, what do you think actually happened there in terms of what was the dynamic, just guessing from what's come out between Biden and Putin in the room there? I don't know how much of a difference it will make either way, what the tone was or what kinds of, specifically what was said. But if you could characterize it briefly based on what's come out, what do you think it was, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know for sure, of course, because we, weren't privy to anything but the first, opening, hi, how are you? It's nice to see you moments in front of the camera. But, the Russian president is well known for being extremely stoic, businesslike, and having an incredible command of facts and arguments. And it must be said that Joe Biden is also known as a long-time foreign policy professional with his years in the Senate on the Foreign Relations Committee and representing the U.S. So I would suggest that it was, as described, businesslike, probably cold, a presenting of each other's sides and what each other would do without the unnecessary boisterousness and, jingoism that, let's say, that Joe Biden presents when he's talking to the U.S. media rather than to the Russian president. And we saw a perfect example of that coming out of a U.S. senator from Mississippi, Roger Wicker.
I'm glad you bring that up. We have the video. Yeah. Let's play this clip. My monologue was on this clip this morning, so I'm glad you bring that up.
I mean, you could just play Dr. Strangelove instead if you wanted.
Flip.
They are there, and also there's certainly nothing wrong with us, Neil, getting our troops in place in NATO countries that are treaty allies of ours. So I would be supportive of that.
Senator,
Neil, I would not rule out military action. I think we start making a mistake when we take options off the table. So I would hope the president keeps that option on the table, and to the extent that he has agreed to reverse his mistake on Nord Stream 2, if that is in fact what came out of the discussion today, I would applaud that. Hope he does it.
All right, what does military action mean, Senator?
Well, military action could mean that we stand off with our ships in the Black Sea and we rain destruction on Russian military capability. It could mean that. It could mean that we participate, and I would not rule that out. I would not rule out American troops on the ground. We don't. Do you know we don't rule out first-use nuclear action. We don't think it'll happen, but there's certain things in negotiations, if you're going to be tough, that you don't take off the table. And so I think the president should say that everything is on the table. And frankly, to the extent that you had Democrats on the show right before me being quoted as saying we need to be tougher, I support that and I appreciate that. I think they represent the fear that we have, the realization that we have in the Congress, that losing a free democratic Ukraine to Russian invasion would be a game changer for a free Europe.
And I kind of made the point this morning that the free democratic Ukraine was the one that was basically destroyed in the coup. And the Democratic choice on this was basically these other districts that didn't want to deal with Nazis roaming through the Capitol. I mean, like, that statement is so unhinged and so
there's almost nothing true in that statement. It is, first of all, it's insane. We don't rule out first-use nuclear strike. I mean, that's Dr. Strangelove or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb by Kubrick stuff. That's all I could see, right? Is the senator aware that Russia has an equivalent number of nuclear weapons as the United States, and they also have hypersonic missiles now as well that can evade U.S. missile defenses much better than the U.S. equivalent can Russia's? I'm just, Tulsi Gabbard had a good, retort to that, saying that this person was obviously unhinged and insane, and. What's even more shocking is that President Obama had considered sending this guy to the U.S. as the UN ambassador.
No way.
This is rather insane. I mean, and all of the other things. Of course, the regime in Kiev is neither free nor democratic, despite all the rhetoric to the contrary. Elections held not just at the barrel of a gun, but under shelling of Grad rocket artillery. With under the jackboots of Azov brown shirt neo-Nazi militias, with political parties banned and lustrated, opposition political leaders imprisoned, opposition media banned from the country. I mean, none of that is free or democratic by my standards. I mean, maybe by Roger Wicker's standards, that is free and democratic. I really can't say. I've never actually been to Mississippi, and I don't ever have any intention of going there after hearing this unhinged lunatic go off. But it should be. And second of all, the U.S. is restricted by the Montreux Convention to only having, as a non-literal state, of only having 2 ships in the Black Sea at a time. First of all, U.S. Would be extremely outnumbered in such a scenario compared to the Russian Black Sea Fleet, and the idea that they could rain down destruction is almost as insane and unhinged from reality as the idea of launching a nuclear first strike and precipitating World War III and the destruction of the world. Luckily, Joe Biden is talking neither about using nuclear weapons and has completely ruled out sending U.S. troops into Ukraine, which would almost certainly trigger a Russian military response, that they are claiming to want to stop, when there are actually very little indications that it could actually happen anyway, at least not in the near future.
So, I agree with you, Mark. I mean, it's unhinged, to put it mildly. And you would hope that there would be rational media that would kind of browbeat that guy and not just in the interview. Like, that's so hysterical. I mean, because the question becomes, what do you think Russia's going to do in response? Like, it's almost as if he thinks, yeah, we should rain down, what he said, rain down fire on Russia in this particular situation, as if, one, you're going to take out all of their armaments. Meaning, because the only way that he thinks he gets out of this without any kind of just dramatically traumatic repercussions is that in the first strike, you get out everything. You destroy all the weapons, you destroy all retaliation capability, and that is not going to happen. I don't know.
Yeah, I have to believe as a U.S. senator, he actually doesn't believe any of that. It's simply the way that they feed red meat to their political base.
You think it's just bravado?
Yeah. Yeah, I would think so. I would hope so. I would certainly hope so, that he's not that insane and incompetent, at his job. But, also, the media eats that stuff up. I mean, I'm remember, in the not so distant past, just the last few years, hearing, some of the most storied CNN reporters talking lovingly and in poetic terms of being on U.S. warships while cruise missiles were launched aggressively against Syria. And, U.S. media, let's face it, are completely jingoistic, sycophantic, warmongering. They drive these wars themselves, and the political hysteria, which contributes to them. That's why we call it the fourth estate, because they have actual political power, and they are often warmongering than a lot of the politicians.
You're talking about Brian
Although
Williams.
It must be said, I am talking about. I was trying not to.
No, I would call his name out. Because I know exactly what he was like. The light of our missiles, light the sky or something. Like, he started quoting poetry as that missile.
Yeah, I thought he was going to masturbate, while he was watching it. But the media is only marginally better than Roger Wicker, in their amount of really driving U.S. foreign policy, like, you're not going to bomb that country? Are we weak now? Or, it's kind of insane, and it's extremely dangerous. But of course, the nature of the media and the clickbait news reporting in order to generate ratings, hits, and profits.
Maybe, but they also, but I'll put it like this. I like where you were going with that last point, the idea of, okay, it's clickbaity, it's an incentive they always have. But you know what else would make good news? You know what else would get a lot of clicks? Is if somebody were to take to the stage and be like, you are all hypocrites and cowards calling for, you know what I mean? That kind of messaging also, if it's served to the public and if they get to see the back and forth, that's popular too. That would get a lot of traction. And I see it as the editorial room.
That would never get past
exactly, and that's the real thing. That's what I'm saying. You at the end, you said the incentive, the clickbaity incentive, that kind of thing. That's what you were targeting. I'm just saying, no, flat out, no. It is the editorial board. It is the meeting with Biden where they ask for more positive coverage, and it's, I'm sure, all of the extra money they get from the way they cover wars and conflicts, and it's just the bias that everybody knows about on the media on the top end and in the back end. I guess I'm preaching to the choir in some sense. My only point was the incentive thing, that would get a lot of play too, and I wish that we saw that kind of dynamic, of course. Somebody arguing with them, wait, what conflict are you trying to get us into? How many American lives? Where exactly on the map is Ukraine? That's the kind of question that a lot of Americans, frankly, would want answered, even asked. Because they're just not that familiar with these conflicts.
I'm quite sure that all of Sputnik's listeners are intelligent enough to know where Ukraine is.
Oh, for sure. Well, we talk about it enough, of course. But my point is, it's not the kind of thing that until this became an issue, until the last handful of years, admittedly, since it became a flashpoint between the U.S. and Russia in 2013 to 2014, and the pivoting on that, it hadn't been a topic of major coverage. So I will forgive a lot of people for not being familiar with it. My point is, if somebody came out and started to seriously push back, that would get traction. And the fact that we're not seeing that, it's not because of some incentive the media has. It's because of this pressure from the top, right?
Well, there are people doing it, not necessarily in the media, but the Kinsey Institute for Responsible Statecraft is, what they're now calling restrainers, or what they call themselves, of course, as realists in foreign policy, are actually talking that talk very strongly and very well right now. The media is just, not picking up much of it.
I'm curious, from your standpoint, do you think that, let's say for the moment, that the conversation given by the person who's basically this kind of anonymous person to the AP, that Biden is pushing Ukraine for the Minsk agreement. A, do you believe, you don't believe that at all?
No, I think that he will tell Zelensky to effectively stall for another 5 or so years and, talk some talk. But this is the thing. Like, if he started to implement Minsk Accords, and had a vote in the Rada, which I don't believe could actually pass. He doesn't have that. He's got 24% approval rating, and he's got strong opposition in the Rada from Poroshenko's ultra-nationalist, supposedly European Solidarity Party. But if he started to implement, if he issued an amnesty, which is part of the Minsk Accords, and sat down with the political leadership in Donbass for discussions, as is required, he would be facing a far-right, Banderite, fascist, another Maidan in Kiev. And I mean, that is obvious. And by now, these far-right sector, Azov, they are completely integrated throughout the military, the security services, the police.
Azov Battalion is the group of Nazis that was hanging on stage with John McCain.
Yeah, literal neo-Nazis. I mean, literal, undeniable neo-Nazis, right? And they're far from the only ones, of course, but they are extremely large. They have their own, political formation, and they are, I mean, Zelensky went to the front to talk to their membership. Right, and basically ask for their support on a prisoner exchange measure, and the head of the Ukrainian armed forces just brought Dmitry Yurosh, the head of the right sector, right, a fascist organization, undeniably, as his advisor, hired him to try to win over the approval of the large number of right sector that are now in the Ukrainian military. That's got to be frightening to Zelensky, much less the people of East Ukraine or people in Russia. I can't say that I have any sympathy for him because he is pandering to them so much. Once again claiming that Nazi collaborators just the other day were heroes of Ukraine. Again, I mean, it's ad nauseum, and he does that to keep them on side so that they don't, they're the ones who fought the Maidan regime into power in the first place on the streets of Kiev and fought the initial war to try to subjugate Donbass to that seizure of power. They are the ones that keep that regime in power in Ukraine, and they probably have the ability to take the government out again. If Zelensky was actually to do this. So, no, I don't believe that Joe Biden will really pressure Kiev, like threatening to turn off, its IMF spigot that props up the regime there, unless Kiev does so. I just simply can't see Joe Biden doing that because he knows what the domestic political consequences of that would be with a rise of the ultranationalists, another Maidan, the destabilization of the U.S.-backed regime there. It would basically split the regime supporters in half.
But wouldn't the U.S. almost prefer? Wouldn't the U.S. and I will note, based on what you're saying, the whole thing of withholding the IMF loans, that of course is something that Biden has done before with Ukraine, asking them to change it. What did you say?
But not for this.
Not for this. No, I was asking them to change a prosecutor over. No, that's a different ask. My point was that the tactic was the same, and that's an illusion that I think you're making that people who might not necessarily get. But wouldn't it be to the Biden administration's benefit? At least I could see them plausibly making a case to themselves. Hey, let's just let the right take over in Ukraine, because if you got the Nazis in charge, well, they're never going to swing back towards Russia. In other words, under Zelensky, if he were to play the right nation-building, game-making moves, and under future leaders, theoretically, you can get a modified position where Ukraine has. I don't know how this works, but they do lean back towards some peaceful, amicable relationship with Russia. But from the American perspective, if the Nazis are in charge, that's never going to happen, right? So isn't it to our benefit to let them slide into power in some sense?
I think Nazis under the table, Nazi grey cardinals like Perubi is one thing, but the Banderite fascist openly ruling the country is another thing entirely. Yeah. That would be very hard even for the U.S. with its propaganda machine to sell, and they would face ever increasing amounts of domestic in the rest of the largely somnolescent Ukraine, that simply that would be a step too far.
That would be a step too far for the public,
particularly for
they'd get pushed back
for large amounts of public.
Yeah, and you might get an actual genuine revolution, not just a U.S.-backed one, something like that could come out of that. So right now, in some ways, the great cardinal, that kind of gray eminence standing behind the scenes presence that some of these people have, that might be the optimal situation from the American perspective, a status quo they want to maintain. Because this is a government that's just stable enough to serve as a vehicle for American interests, and incorporates just enough of that right-wing destabilizing energy to keep them from swinging towards Russia. Mark, that seems like a pretty concise picture in some ways there, and that's why we talk with you. We're going to close this out, I think. But Mark Sloboda, as always, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me. It's always fun talking to you guys.
Yeah, always fun talking to you, too. Mark Sloboda, for those listening, is an international relations and security analyst who you should go and follow on Twitter at MarkSloboda1. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. When we come back from our break, we'll be taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Be back in just a minute.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Well, we're back for like 12, 13 minutes here, taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Again, 202-521-1320. Let's go to Nathan, calling in from Detroit. Nathan, you're on. What's going on?
Good morning, gentlemen. I just want to compliment Jamarl on your excellent T-shirt collection. And
oh yeah. I try to bring him out because he doesn't talk about him. But when I see him wearing some, he has the Transformers on right now, a red moon with the Transformers silhouette.
I don't think that's a Transformer. That's some kind of manga
even better, dude. Like yeah. I'm not up to date on this stuff, but no, he has a cool collection. I'm sorry for cutting in like that, Nathan. But what's on your?
But thank you, Nathan. I appreciate it.
It looks like Voltron, but anyway, I was calling about something that Ted Rall touched on earlier, which was, when are we ever going to hold Hillary Clinton responsible for this whole Russiagate nonsense?
That is a good question. I mean, Durham was kind of just going around the edges of that whole stuff. And if we think about it, I mean, they were going after Trump, saying he was working with a foreign power. Well, it was the Democratic Party working with Ukraine in order to get information out on Trump in that situation. And many of the people that they were getting, it wasn't even related to Trump and Russia. It was just, Manafort is with Trump, and so we're going to find dirt on Manafort using information from Ukraine to do so. Like, they were working literally with the foreign government to do it. And then Democrats would say, well, she paid them. That's the difference.
They were literally, and that's the crucial thing of the article that set up a lot of this stuff over in Politico. Ken Vogel was one of the co-authors on that. Ken Vogel and somebody else, but Ken Vogel is the big name from that. This Politico.
John Solomon was one too.
As another separate line of coverage, I think that we're talking about. But basically, name of this Politico article back in the day, looking into the name is escaping me. I was going to pitch it out because it's been a little while though. But basically, there's this wave of coverage where the Clinton campaign, the DNC directly, specifically the Chalupa sisters, working directly with the Ukrainian embassy on behalf of the Ukrainian government, getting information, and none of this stuff is. They might dismiss it when they bring it up. Only, they bring it up only to dismiss it in the mainstream media. But if you look into the facts, it's all extremely clear that they were, on behalf of the DNC. You had. I'm just forgetting her first name. It's been a little while since I've covered this stuff.
Which one? Alexandra Chalupa.
Thank you, Alexandra Chalupa. Thank you for that, Jamarl. Alexandra Chalupa, working on behalf of the DNC, communicating with the Ukrainian embassy, getting information, Oppo research on Paul Manafort. And when I say working on behalf of the DNC, well, really, she's working on behalf of the Clintons because, and this is partly released through WikiLeaks emails, showing communications between her and the comms director for the DNC, who was hand-selected by the Clintons. And in that email thread specifically, you can just look up Chalupa, and just, again, I need to get the guy's name, the comms director, just bringing back older memories. Mm-hmm. In other words, she's communicating directly with the Clintons person in the DNC to do opposition research, working directly with a foreign government, which is a crucial point. Russiagate was all about a foreign government colluding with the Trump campaign to get Oppo research and the WikiLeaks dumps and all this stuff done to harm the Clinton campaign. Meanwhile, the Clinton, and that all turns out to be bunk. Meanwhile, the Clinton campaign was actually working with the Ukrainian government directly, and not just the DNC, but like the Clintons directly executing this stuff. It's completely, anyway, I'm sorry for cutting in. I took too much time trying to explain the backstory there, but you mentioned it. I wanted to get to explain it a little bit for folks who weren't familiar. Please keep going, or go for it.
Well, I think you're doing an excellent job there, Shane. But on top of that, I mean, we have Hunter Biden's laptop trail of breadcrumbs also pointing at Ukraine. These guys are eyeball deep in corruption. They're going to get slaughtered for the next decade over this politically. This may be the funeral march of the DNC.
I gosh darn hope so. I mean, if there's some justice in the world,
yeah, right,
then it will be, because this has been a huge crime. Like, this is the kind of thing that kills a democracy. It's when you have one major political party doing all this stuff just to tear down the other one, and none of it turns out to have anything to do with what's good for the American public. It's just inside political rivalries, and ones that are world-threatening when they have to do with potential nuclear war with another country, which is part of what this led to. I mean, Russiagate is an inflammatory part of our relationship with Russia. Yeah, it seems key there. Anyway, Jamarl.
The attempted soft coup. I mean, a whole point of that
in the U.S.,
in the U.S., was to either win, meaning to beat Trump, or after Trump was in office, to basically extricate him, basically rip him from the office, using basically conspiracy theory to do it. If Mueller would have found anything, real or imagined, they would have used that as a pretext to basically impeach and remove Trump from office. Mm-hmm. They would have looking for anything to do it. Mm-hmm. And, we reach, after Trump is out of office and you have Durham doing an investigation, and you have one person after the next getting either perp-walked or indicted on that very specific claim that they were lying about it.
What was the first impeachment of Trump about? You got to remember, it was about trying to get is that phone call,
right,
with Zelensky.
Yeah.
And there are two things there. One, trying to get info on Hunter Biden. Mm-hmm. Two, trying to get info on these servers. Trump brings up these servers. The second one I'll dismiss because I think there was a massive misunderstanding about the DNC servers and exactly what that was by Trump and his crew. But on the first one, this idea of working with, the Ukrainian government to get information on Hunter Biden's misdeeds, that was portrayed, and, maybe rightly, okay, that's Trump doing opposition research, but he's doing that in a phone call with the Ukrainian government. I get mainstream media, liberal media kind of wants to get pissed about that. But think about how they dismissed that at the time. This was well before the Hunter Biden laptop leaks came out from the New York Post. They dismissed that as, that's a Russian-backed thing. Russia working with Trump, trying to get rid of Biden, trying to push him out of the wings. It was, again, a doubling down of the narrative that this was partly a Russian-backed operation in Ukraine with Trump on that phone call and Russian misinformation leading him to do that. But guess what? Folks? This was before all of that stuff. Well, it had been verified at the time with Hunter Biden, but this is before the laptop story came out, before the New York Post broke that one last year. Yeah. This is late 2019, early 2020. Of course, early 2020 was when the impeachment happened. This was well before the Hunter Biden story broke from the New York Post. My point is, let's revisit that for a second. And what we'll see is everything that was said by the Democrats at the time when they were trying to literally impeach Trump, a second coup,
they were lying,
or an extension of the first one. They were lying. They got it completely wrong. And the opposite case, the one that Trump was more trying to make, that there's this weird stuff that Hunter was up to that should be investigated, 100% right.
Yeah.
And it's like one thing after another, one aspect of the story after another. We really need to reconsider, folks.
And no consequences. Like, for all of these people that got it wrong for the last 3 or 4 years, that's what's annoying me about that story with Biden. It's like, Biden has been getting such bad coverage. They tried to take him out of office with a conspiracy theory. Yep. What are you talking about? And it was one of those things that had such a cacophony that anywhere you go, that was the conversation. And every day in the news, the exact same conversation, any and everything come up. And many of those stories were just wrong, or just lies, or just incompetence on some level, but malicious incompetence, meaning you never got the story of Trump doing something right. when they were wrong, they got the story with Trump doing something wrong. And it was persistently that way. So do I think Hillary Clinton is going to see consequences? No, not in the least. Do I think the journalists who got it wrong for 3, 4, 5 years? No. Don't think there are going to be any consequences at all, no more than there were for weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
And you know what? Hillary, I hope that the Democrats remember Hillary Clinton with some disdain, because she was the one who got them into this whole mess, or at least the Clintonite camp did. She was the one, hers was the camp that hoodwinked all of them into thinking that this whole thing had happened, right?
Yep.
They let them, and you should blame them too, because they let themselves get deluded by such an obvious pack of lies. But they were the ones, you know, she was the one who set them up for it. And if our caller was right, Nathan, I think you were, and if you're right that this is the death knell of the DNC, the Democrats going forward, guess who's to blame for it? Well, it's Hillary, it's the Clintons. It all goes back to the choices they made 2015, 2016, that whole thing.
Right.
We have other callers. I think we should get to them. Tammy calling in from D.C. You're on the line. What's on your mind?
Yes, hi. I was calling about the Ukraine situation. You know what? I don't understand how did you remember the Ruby Ridge situation? This, to me, looked like the same thing, and I don't blame Putin.
The Ruby Ridge, but which situation looks like that? I'm sorry. You're talking about the Waco thing there.
That was back in I think it was 1991.
Or no, not Waco. I'm getting confused. Ruby Ridge, 1992, Idaho near Naples. Yes, that other sort of...
Where did it all start? It started from the guy whose wife got shot by the, what was it, FBI or CIA or something, I forgot. Because they never really showed, I have not seen the movie no more. However, it started from food he was stealing. Then it was also gas. So he was electricity or gas. But I understand where the people, the militia groups, because they should not, the Clintons did not see those people in the column to shoot to kill. That's where all this stuff is started.
I can kind of see where you're going, Tammy, which is a lot of the sense that government overreach, that the government will push down, do abusive stuff to these groups. And I associate Ruby Ridge with Waco just because those are, you know, I don't know. Right. Similar kinds of events, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I was super young. I was like literally 10 days old when this event started back in August 21st, 1992, the Ruby Ridge standoff. So I was super young. But your point is the sense that the government will respond overzealously and just push back any kind of civic organization if it has the potential for political dissidence. Is that kind of where you're going, Tammy?
Yes, indeed. You read my mind.
That makes sense. I can see why your head goes there, and that's an interesting connection. It's something I want to look back into Ruby Ridge because I was young. I need to learn more about it. But Tammy, thank you for the call. Thank you for bringing that up.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. We got Joe calling in from Tuscan. Joe, you're on. What's on your mind?
Greetings, fellas. I know time is short, so I'll just kind of crunch this together. There won't be any investigation of Hunter's computer. I think you guys reported a story yesterday. Epstein had a tub of files returned to him in that alleged investigation.
That wasn't us. That wasn't us reporting. Heard it from somebody else, but go for it.
Sorry, I heard that. Yeah, but and there won't be any autopsies. We can't get one done on the Democratic Party after losing to a clown. We can't get an audit done in the military budget because this is the corporate hobbling of what's going on. But it also coincides with the numbers that Jamarl read yesterday. And, you know, when the Boston Globe or whoever it was, 25% approval for Biden.
Yeah. That's brutal. That is very brutal.
And that style of politics, that time is running out. And I think it will coincide with who we're going to be as Democrats. But, you know, the corporate wing of the power is firmly in control right now. I don't know how that ends out with, you know, our really old in power right now. But what happens after we get smoked? If you believe the general ballot, you know, mutilizing numbers that we are facing as Democrats for those that are Democrats, this is ugly, dudes. So,
well, but you're saying that you think that the corporate-backed part of the DNC is just too firmly entrenched to allow any change to happen. Our earlier caller just a couple of minutes ago, Nathan, saw this as the death knell, the undoing of these stories. I don't know which is which, but
We'll find out.
We're fault lines, and we like to bring these opposing points of view. Thank you to our callers, and thank you to our guests this morning. Thank you, everybody, for listening to us today. We'll be back tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. Eastern, as always. Have a great day, folks. Signing off. See you on the other side.